In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there was a time, so ancient that even the oldest archives of Terra speak of it only in whispers, when the galaxy knew a different kind of darkness. Not the brutal, mindless savagery that defines our current age, but something far more terrifying: the cold, calculated manipulation of life itself by beings who considered themselves gods. When the galaxy was young, and the stars themselves were but infants in the cosmic nursery, long before the grim darkness that defines the 41st millennium, the Old Ones emerged from origins so ancient that even the most learned archivists of Terra can only speculate about their true beginning. Their origins remain shrouded in mystery even to the most learned tech adepts and chaos sorcerers of the current age. But what fragments of knowledge survive paint a picture of beings who achieved mastery over life itself when the universe was barely recognizable from its current hellish state. Picture, if you will, a galaxy where the Webway was not a crumbling relic jealously guarded by dying Eldar, but a vast network spanning hundreds of thousands of star systems. Imagine worlds where evolution was not a random process taking millions of years, but a guided art form completed in mere centuries by beings who could speak directly to genetic material and command it to change. Envision a time when psychic power was not the dangerous, corruption-prone ability we know today, but a tool of creation wielded with the casual ease of a craftsman shaping clay. The Old Ones were not merely another xenospecies to be catalogued and purged. They were the galaxy's first true masters, reality shapers who predated every civilization currently known to Imperial scholars. When mankind's ancestors were still primitive organisms struggling in Terra's primordial oceans, the Old Ones had already built an empire that spanned the galaxy. When the Eldar first opened their eyes to consciousness, it was because the Old Ones had designed them to do so. When the first Ork raised a crude weapon in battle, it was following genetic programming placed there by amphibious gods who understood warfare on a scale that would make even the greatest Imperial strategists weep in awe. Yet for all their godlike power, the Old Ones possessed a fatal flaw that would ultimately lead to their extinction and birth the greatest horror the galaxy has ever known. Their achievements mock our current understanding of what is possible. The Webway that confounds our greatest tech priests? They built it as casually as we might construct a roadway. The Eldar, whose psychic abilities and technological prowess still surpass our own after 65 million years. They were designed as servants, creatures crafted to fulfill specific purposes in the Old One's grand design. The Orks, whose technology works through collective belief and whose genetic memory allows them to rebuild complex weapons from scrap. They are the devolved descendants of the Krork, warrior species engineered to fight the Old One's wars. But perhaps most terrifying of all is this truth. The Chaos Gods themselves, the ruinous powers that have turned our galaxy into a hell beyond description, were born from the Old One's own experiments. Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch, and the birth-pending Slaanesh. All of them are consequences of what happened when beings with the power of gods decided to wage war without considering the consequences of their actions. The Imperial Creed teaches us that the Emperor protects, but even he in his infinite wisdom has never claimed dominion over life and death itself on the scale achieved by the Old Ones. The Mechanicus seeks the perfection of flesh through machinery, but the Old Ones achieved perfection of flesh through flesh itself, creating biological technologies that could reshape entire worlds. The Eldar speak of their fall as the greatest catastrophe in galactic history, but their fall was merely an echo of a far greater disaster, the extinction of their creators. But to understand how beings capable of creating entire species could fall so completely, we must journey back to an era when the galaxy was an ocean of possibility, rather than the nightmare it has become. Consider the scope of their achievement: a single species that guided the evolution of hundreds of others, that built transportation networks spanning the galaxy, that achieved mastery over the fundamental forces of life and death. They did not conquer the galaxy through superior firepower or political manipulation. They created it species by species, world by world, according to their grand design. They were gardeners working on a galactic scale, and every psychically active race in the current galaxy bears their fingerprints. Yet they are gone. Extinct. Their vast empire reduced to ruins and fragmentary records. Their servant species either fall into corruption or devolved into shadows of their intended purpose. Their greatest creation, the Webway itself, slowly crumbling without maintenance. How does a species with such power simply disappear? The answer lies in a war that lasted millions of years, fought on a scale that makes the Horus Heresy look like a minor skirmish. A war between the masters of life and the masters of death, between those who sought to guide evolution and those who embraced the perfection of the machine. A war that literally broke the galaxy and gave birth to the entities we now know as chaos. This is the story of how gods fell to their own hubris, how the galaxy's golden age ended in catastrophe, and how the consequences of that ancient conflict still shape every moment of our current existence. It is a tale of power beyond imagination, of corruption beyond redemption, and of a legacy that will haunt the galaxy until the stars themselves burn out. The Old One's story is our story, for we are all children of their ambition and victims of their failure. In their rise and fall lies the key to understanding not just how our universe became the hell it is today, but perhaps, if we are very lucky or very foolish, how it might yet be saved. To truly comprehend the magnitude of what the Old Ones achieved, and what they ultimately destroyed, we must first understand the galaxy as it existed in their earliest days, some 65 million years ago. This was not the cramped, war-torn hellscape we know today, where every system bristles with weapons and every world has been carved up by millennia of conquest. This was a galaxy of infinite potential, where evolution proceeded at its natural pace, and the fundamental forces of creation had not yet been twisted into instruments of corruption. The stellar cartographers of the Adeptus Mechanicus, in their rare moments of philosophical contemplation, estimate that the galaxy of that primordial era contained perhaps 23% fewer star systems than exist today. Star formation was less dense, stellar nurseries were scattered across vast distances, and the heavy elements necessary for complex world building were rarer. Most importantly, the warp itself, that parallel dimension of psychic energy that now threatens to consume reality, existed in a state of relative calm that would be unimaginable to any Imperial navigator. Picture the Imperium as it was then, not the storm-racked nightmare realm where daemons hunt for souls and reality shifts according to the whims of mad gods, but a gentle ocean of psychic potential. The emotional resonance of trillions of sentient beings had not yet awakened the ruinous powers. Chaos, as we understand it, simply did not exist. The warp was merely the galaxy's subconscious, vast, largely dormant, and waiting for something to stir it into terrible wakefulness. These early signs would lead to changes that would reshape not just worlds, but the very fabric of reality itself. Ocean worlds were far more common in this ancient era, a fact that would prove crucial to understanding the Old One's eventual dominance. The different atmospheric compositions and cosmic radiation patterns of the time favored aquatic evolution, creating countless worlds where amphibious life could flourish. Where our current galaxy is dominated by terrestrial species, adapted to relatively dry conditions, the primordial galaxy was a vast archipelago of water worlds connected by space itself. Archaeological evidence, what little survives the systematic destruction of the Age of Strife and the aggressive ignorance of Imperial doctrine, suggests that the first stirrings of Old One influence began as subtle alterations to natural evolutionary processes. Planetary development patterns that seemed normal on the surface, but contained mathematical progressions too perfect to be coincidental. Gravitational anomalies around certain star systems that suggested massive engineering projects operating on timescales of millions of years. The Magos biologists of the Adeptus Mechanicus have identified genetic markers in at least 12 major species that trace back to this period. Modifications so sophisticated that even our most advanced gene writes cannot fully understand their function. These are not crude genetic manipulations like the Emperor's work on the Primarchs, but fundamental rewrites of evolutionary possibility itself. DNA sequences that contain information in formats our scientists cannot even recognize, let alone decode. What appeared to be natural evolution was actually something far more deliberate and infinitely more dangerous to the galaxy's future. Consider the evidence that survives fossil records showing evolutionary jumps that occurred not over millions of years, but over mere thousands. Biological specimens preserved in stasis fields so ancient that their technology predates anything in Imperial archives, yet still functioning after eons of abandonment. Organic structures that appear to have grown rather than been built, following architectural principles that combine aesthetics with biological function in ways that challenge our understanding of both engineering and evolution. The Webway fragments that still exist provide perhaps our clearest window into this ancient era. Imperial scholars estimate that the original network spanned at least 15,000 star systems, with major junction points that could accommodate vessels larger than our greatest battleships. But these were not mere transportation tunnels. They were living structures that grew and adapted according to the needs of their users, forming a nervous system for a galactic organism of unimaginable complexity. Warp resonance patterns detected by our most sensitive psychers suggest that during this period, massive psychic engineering projects were conducted across multiple sectors simultaneously. These were not the crude, dangerous rituals favored by chaos cultists, but precise applications of psychic force that required coordination between thousands of powerful minds working in perfect harmony. The psychic scars left by these projects can still be detected today, appearing as areas where the boundary between real space and the warp remains unusually thin. The connections forming between scattered experiments would soon reveal a pattern of intelligence operating on a scale that challenged the very gods. Statistical analysis of evolutionary patterns from this period reveals what Imperial savants call the convergence, a gradual acceleration of natural development across hundreds of worlds that began approximately 67 million years ago. Species that should have required tens of millions of years to develop complex nervous systems were achieving sapience in mere millennia. Ecosystems were becoming more sophisticated, more balanced, more designed. The first appearance of psychically active species dates to this period, creatures whose mental abilities far exceeded anything that natural selection could explain. These early psychers were not the tortured, corruption-prone individuals we know today. Their abilities were stable, sustainable, and precisely tailored to their species' needs. They were living proof that psychic power could be a tool of creation rather than destruction. But perhaps most ominously, this is also when Imperial archaeologists begin to find evidence of the first biotechnological artifacts. Devices that were clearly artificial yet followed no recognizable engineering principles. Structures that seemed to merge seamlessly with their organic users. Weapons that appeared to be as much living tissue as mechanical component. These discoveries suggest that someone or something was already experimenting with the fundamental boundary between life and technology. Climate data from this era shows that numerous worlds underwent rapid but stable environmental changes, transforming from barren rocks into garden paradises in timeframes that conventional terraforming could never achieve. Atmospheric compositions shifted toward configurations optimal for complex life. Ocean currents were subtly redirected to create more favorable weather patterns, and even planetary rotation speeds were occasionally adjusted to provide ideal day-night cycles. The patterns were too consistent, too perfect, too obviously designed to be natural. Something was actively gardening the galaxy, world by world, species by species, with patience measured in geological ages, and ambition that spanned the entire cosmos. The old ones were announcing their presence not through conquest or destruction, but through creation on a scale that dwarfed the works of any subsequent civilization. Yet even as they shaped evolution itself to their will, they were setting in motion forces that would eventually destroy them and transform their garden galaxy into the hellscape we inhabit today. The gradual transition from subtle influence to overt dominance marked the true emergence of the old ones as a galactic power. No longer content to guide evolution from the shadows, they began to reveal themselves to their creations, and to the other ancient races who shared the primordial galaxy. What had been a careful, patient cultivation of life's potential became something far more direct, far more ambitious, and ultimately far more dangerous. The first concrete evidence of Old One presence appears in the mythological records of multiple species, a consistency that cannot be explained by coincidence or cultural contamination. The Eldar speak of the first singers, beings who shaped their souls with melodies that could rewrite reality. Primitive human mythologies, buried deep in our genetic memory, tell of amphibious gods who emerged from primordial waters to grant the gift of consciousness. Even the Orks, in their rare moments of philosophical reflection, refer to makers who built them for eternal war. Archaeological evidence supports these mythological accounts. Functioning biotechnological artifacts have been discovered across dozens of worlds. Devices so sophisticated that they remain beyond our understanding, despite 65 million years of technological advancement. These are not crude tools hammered from raw materials, but elegant fusion of organism and machine that seem to grow rather than be manufactured. Weapons that bond with their users' nervous systems, vehicles that repair themselves through biological processes, structures that adapt their configuration according to environmental needs. This gradual development was building toward a breakthrough that would fundamentally alter the relationship between matter and consciousness. The genetic signatures found in these artifacts reveal DNA sequences of impossible complexity. Not the relatively simple 4-base coding used by all known life, but intricate patterns that incorporate exotic amino acids and molecular structures that our best geneticists cannot even synthesize. These genetic templates appear to encode not just biological functions but consciousness itself, creating organisms that are simultaneously individual entities and components of a vast collective intelligence. The Old Ones' first breakthrough came in their mastery of consciousness transfer, the ability to encode a thinking mind into genetic material and then recreate that mind in a new biological form. This was not the crude preservation techniques used by some imperial nobles to extend their lives, but true immortality through biological reincarnation. They could die and be reborn with full memories intact, their consciousness flowing seamlessly from one body to another like water poured between vessels. This breakthrough led directly to their second great achievement, the acceleration of evolution itself. By understanding how consciousness shaped biological development, they learned to compress millions of years of natural selection into mere centuries. They could take a primitive species and guide its development toward any desired outcome, crafting creatures perfectly adapted to specific environments or purposes. Evolution became their art form, and they were master artists. The organization emerging from these experiments would soon present an ultimatum that would divide the galaxy into two opposing philosophies. The Old Ones established their primary colonies on waterworlds across 5 major galactic sectors, choosing locations that provided both the aquatic environments they preferred and strategic positions for expanding their influence. These were not mere settlements but vast research facilities where they conducted their experiments and guided evolution. Each colony specialized in different aspects of their work, some focused on consciousness transfer, others on ecosystem design, still others on the development of new psychic abilities. Their systematic mapping and cataloging of galactic evolutionary potential revealed a universe filled with unrealized possibilities. They identified worlds where life could be encouraged to develop, species that showed potential for psychic awakening, and ecological systems that could be enhanced to support more complex forms of consciousness. The galaxy became their laboratory, and every living thing within it became a potential subject for their experiments. The creation of their first true servant species marked a new phase in Old One expansion. The Slan were not merely uplifted primitives, but purpose-built beings designed from the ground up to serve as intermediaries between the Old Ones and their other creations. Tall, intelligent, and possessing powerful psychic abilities, the Slan became the Old Ones' hands and voices across the galaxy, establishing colonies, overseeing experiments, and ensuring that their master's will was carried out on distant worlds. Early construction of what would become the Webway network began during this period, starting as simple transportation tunnels between major Old One colonies, but gradually expanding into the vast interdimensional highway that would eventually span the galaxy. These early Webway passages were living structures that grew according to their builders' needs, forming a nervous system that allowed instant communication and travel across interstellar distances. An ideological shift was gaining momentum that would ultimately transform the Old Ones from benevolent shepherds into something far more dangerous. The other ancient races of the galaxy watched this expansion with growing unease. The Necron, already ancient by the standards of their time, viewed the Old Ones' biological manipulation with particular alarm. Their culture valued natural development and the acceptance of death as a fundamental aspect of existence. To them, the Old Ones' casual disregard for natural evolutionary processes represented a blasphemous corruption of life's essential nature. Philosophical resistance to forced evolution began to coalesce around the Necron's arguments about the value of natural development versus artificial enhancement. Other species, particularly those based on silicon or crystalline biology, found themselves inherently incompatible with Old One techniques and began to form coalitions of resistance. Religious movements emerged among primitive species, teaching that the Old Ones were false gods whose gifts came at the cost of spiritual corruption. The Old Ones' response to this resistance revealed the first signs of the arrogance that would ultimately doom them. Rather than engaging in diplomatic dialogue or seeking compromise, They began to classify species as either suitable for enhancement or obstacles to galactic evolution. Those deemed suitable received the gift of guided development. Those deemed obstacles faced extinction or forced relocation to the galaxy's outer rim. Environmental manipulation became more aggressive during this period, with entire star systems being reconfigured to support Old One expansion. Dead worlds were transformed into garden paradises, hostile environments were made habitable, and existing ecosystems were redesigned to support the specific needs of newly created species. The scale of these projects dwarfed anything attempted by subsequent civilizations. They were literally rebuilding the galaxy according to their vision of what it should become. The development of specialized worker species allowed the Old Ones to extend their reach even further. Rather than personally overseeing every project, they created beings perfectly adapted to specific tasks: aquatic species for underwater construction, silicon-based organisms for work in hostile environments, psychically gifted races for long-distance communication and coordination. Each species was a living tool, designed with absolute precision for its intended purpose. But the most ominous development of this period was the Old Ones' growing disconnection from the consequences of their actions. Drunk on their own power and convinced of their benevolent intentions, they began to view other forms of life not as fellow inhabitants of the galaxy but as raw materials for their grand design. The galaxy was becoming their garden, and they intended to cultivate it according to their aesthetic preferences, regardless of what the existing inhabitants might think about their plans. The stage was set for the conflict that would define the galaxy's future. On one side stood the Old Ones and their growing legion of created species, convinced that they were shepherding the galaxy toward a golden age of psychic enlightenment. On the other stood the Necrons and their allies, determined to preserve natural evolution and the acceptance of death as a fundamental aspect of existence. Neither side could have imagined that their conflict would awaken something in the warp that would ultimately devour them both. The transition from mysterious gardeners to overt galactic dominators marked a fundamental shift in how the Old Ones interacted with the universe around them. No longer content to work in the shadows, they began to display their capabilities openly, demonstrating powers that challenged the very understanding of what was possible. These manifestations of their abilities would serve as both inspiration and warning to the other races of the galaxy, and ultimately provide the first concrete evidence of the fatal arrogance that would doom their civilization. The documentary evidence for Old One capabilities comes from sources as diverse as they are disturbing. Eldar myth cycles, preserved in their most sacred Wraithbone libraries, speak of the first singers who could reshape reality through harmonies that resonated in dimensions beyond normal perception. These songs, according to Eldar legend, could coax new forms of life from barren rock, grant consciousness to mindless beasts, and weave souls from the raw stuff of the warp itself. The Eldar describe their creators not as physical beings, but as living embodiments of creative force, entities who existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions and could manipulate matter through pure will. These demonstrations revealed the Old Ones' true nature, not benevolent shepherds, but cosmic tyrants reshaping life to their whims. Ork genetic memory, encoded in the most primitive layers of their biological programming, contains fragmentary references to Da Makers and Da Old Bosses, beings who built the Krork not through mechanical assembly but through direct manipulation of genetic destiny. Ork mechboys, when questioned under extreme duress, sometimes babble about Da way it used Tabi when their technology didn't just work but grew, evolved, and improved itself according to principles they can no longer comprehend. Their genetic inheritance speaks of a time when warfare was not the crude, chaotic affair it has become, but a precisely orchestrated art form designed to achieve specific evolutionary outcomes. Even Imperial xenobiological databases, despite their notorious unreliability and ideological contamination, contain enough evidence to paint a picture of impossible evolutionary patterns across hundreds of worlds. Species that show genetic modifications so sophisticated that our greatest gene writes describe them as architectural impossibilities, changes that require not just understanding of biology but mastery over the fundamental forces that govern how life itself functions. These are not crude augmentations like those attempted by the Mechanicus, but elegant redesigns that improve upon natural evolution without creating the grotesque side effects that plague most biological enhancement. Perhaps most disturbing are the testimonies recorded from Chaos Daemons during Imperial exorcism rituals. While such sources must be treated with extreme caution due to their inherently corrupting nature, the consistency of their accounts suggests underlying truth. Daemons speak with genuine fear about the first enemy beings who existed before chaos itself and who possessed power over life and death, that even the ruinous powers viewed with respect. They describe the Old Ones not as physical creatures but as forces of creation so potent that their mere presence could reshape local reality according to their will. The specific demonstrations of Old One power that survive in historical records defy conventional understanding of what any single species could achieve. The complete terraforming of dead worlds in mere decades represents perhaps their most documented capability. Imperial survey teams have identified 347 worlds that show clear evidence of Old One environmental manipulation, planets that were transformed from barren rocks into garden paradises with mathematical precision that surpasses even our most advanced terraforming techniques. The opposition forming against them would soon develop weapons that challenged the very foundation of their power. The creation of the Slann, as their first true servitor race, demonstrated their mastery over consciousness itself. These beings were not simply uplifted from existing species, but designed from the ground up to serve as perfect intermediaries between the Old Ones and their other creations. Tall, amphibious, and possessed of psychic abilities that allowed them to communicate across interstellar distances. The Slann represented a new form of life that combined the best aspects of biological and psychic evolution. More importantly, they were created with absolute loyalty programming that made rebellion not just unlikely but literally unthinkable. The development of the Krork warrior species revealed the Old Ones' understanding of warfare as a tool of evolution. These were not the crude, chaotic orcs we know today, but precisely engineered biological weapons designed to grow stronger through combat, adapt to any enemy, and reproduce at rates that could overwhelm any conventional military force. The Krork possessed technological instincts that allowed them to build sophisticated weapons from scrap materials, genetic memory that preserved combat knowledge across generations, and psychic abilities that made their equipment function through collective belief rather than mechanical principles. But perhaps their most impressive achievement was the construction of 2,847 functional Webway gates across the galaxy in a period of less than 10,000 years. Each gate represented a triumph of engineering that combined advanced physics with biological growth patterns, creating transportation networks that existed partially in real space and partially in the warp. These gates could accommodate vessels larger than Imperial battleships while maintaining perfect stability across interstellar distances, a feat that our greatest tech adepts still consider impossible. The Necron tier response to these demonstrations provides perhaps our clearest picture of how other ancient races viewed Old One power. Initial diplomatic contact, established approximately 62 million years ago, began with what appeared to be mutual respect between two advanced civilizations. The Necron tier possessed their own impressive technologies, mechanical mastery that allowed them to build machines of incredible sophistication and durability. They had achieved a form of immortality through consciousness transfer into mechanical bodies, conquered death through technology rather than biology. But as the Necron tier learned more about Old One capabilities, their initial admiration turned to horror. The Old One's casual disregard for natural death cycles, their treatment of entire species as experimental subjects, and their assumption that all life should be remade according to their vision represented everything the Necron tier found philosophically abhorrent. The Necron tier believed that death gave meaning to life, that natural evolution had inherent value, and that consciousness should develop through experience rather than genetic programming. One characteristic above all others marked the Old Ones for destruction: their fatal inability to understand the value of natural death. The philosophical opposition between these two civilizations ran deeper than mere territorial disputes or resource competition. The Necron tier saw the Old Ones as cosmic vandals who were destroying the galaxy's natural beauty in favor of their own artificial designs. They viewed biological manipulation as a corruption of life's essential nature, consciousness transfer as a violation of natural death cycles, and psychic abilities as dangerous tools that opened doorways to realms that should remain sealed. Beginning their technological advancement to counter Old One advantages, the Necron tier embarked on what would become the greatest arms race in galactic history. They developed increasingly sophisticated mechanical technologies, created weapons that could disrupt biological functions at the cellular level, and began experimenting with forces that could match the Old Ones' reality-shaping abilities. This technological development would eventually lead them to contact with entities that promised power beyond imagination, but at a cost that would transform them into something far worse than their enemies. Other ancient races faced their own dilemmas when confronted with Old One power. The Yuvoth, a silicon-based species that valued natural crystalline growth patterns, found themselves forced to choose between submission and extinction. Those who submitted were gradually transformed into biological entities more suitable for Old One purposes, losing their essential nature in exchange for survival. The unknown silicon-based species mentioned in fragmentary Imperial records chose exile instead, fleeing to the galaxy's outer edges rather than face forced conversion. Proto-human ancestors received what appeared to be beneficial treatment, subtle genetic modifications that enhanced their psychic potential and accelerated their cognitive development. But even these gifts came with hidden costs. The genetic modifications that granted humans psychic abilities also made them vulnerable to warp corruption, creating the foundation for the psyker problem that plagues Imperial civilization to this day. The Old One's enhancement of human evolution was not benevolence, but experimental data gathering, using entire species as test subjects for their theories about consciousness development. The escalating complexity of Old One biological warfare preparations during this period revealed their growing paranoia about opposition. Moving beyond simple species creation to ecosystem-wide manipulation, they began developing organisms specifically designed for combat. Living weapons that could think and adapt, biological armor that provided both protection and enhanced abilities. Creatures that existed primarily as weapons but possessed enough intelligence to operate independently when needed. Most disturbing of all was their casual disregard for the consent of species being modified. Entire civilizations would be subjected to genetic restructuring without consultation. Their essential nature changed to better serve Old One purposes. Species that resisted these modifications faced extinction, while those that accepted them often found themselves transformed beyond recognition. The Old Ones had moved beyond seeing themselves as gardeners of galactic evolution. They now viewed themselves as the sole arbiters of what forms life should take. This arrogance, this absolute conviction in their own righteousness, would prove to be their fatal flaw. They had become so convinced of their benevolent intentions that they could no longer recognize the tyranny they had created. In their minds, they were saving the galaxy from the chaos of natural evolution. In reality, they were creating the conditions that would birth an evil far greater than anything the galaxy had ever known. At the height of their power, the Old Ones had achieved something that no species before or since has even approached: the transformation of an entire galaxy into a single perfectly orchestrated biological system. This was their golden age, an era when their mastery over life and death seemed absolute, when their vision of guided evolution appeared to be succeeding beyond their wildest dreams. Yet even at the pinnacle of their success, the seeds of their ultimate destruction were already taking root in the very foundations of their empire. The scope of their achievements during this period defies comprehension. The Webway network had expanded to span over 65,000 star systems, creating a transportation and communication grid that connected every major world in the galaxy. This was not merely a network of tunnels through space. It was a living nervous system that allowed the Old Ones to coordinate activities across interstellar distances with the precision of a single organism. The network could adapt its configuration according to need, growing new passages to connect previously isolated systems and rerouting traffic around areas of disturbance or conflict. They had successfully created and guided the evolution of over 200 psychically active species, each perfectly adapted to its intended role in the galactic ecosystem. The Eldar achieved the ideal balance between psychic power and physical form, becoming living artworks of evolutionary perfection. The Jokaro developed technological intuition that allowed them to build devices of incredible sophistication using only their natural abilities. Hundreds of minor species gained psychic awareness, each contributing its unique perspective to the vast collective consciousness that the Old Ones were weaving across the galaxy. Yet beneath this apparent paradise lay corruption that would doom not just the Old Ones but every living thing in the galaxy. Their mastery over warp space had reached levels that allowed near-instantaneous travel between any 2 points in the galaxy. Unlike the dangerous, unpredictable warp travel used by Imperial vessels, Old One warp manipulation was precise, safe, and efficient. They could step from one world to another as easily as walking between rooms, carrying entire armies or massive construction projects through dimensions that bent to their will. The boundary between real space and the warp had become fluid under their influence, allowing them to draw upon psychic energy as easily as other species might use mechanical power. Their biotechnology had advanced to the point where they could create entire worlds from raw matter, shaping planets according to their aesthetic preferences, with the same ease that a sculptor might work with clay. These were not crude terraforming projects that simply made worlds habitable. They were artistic creations that demonstrated the Old One's vision of what the galaxy should become. Oceans that reflected psychic energy in patterns of impossible beauty, continents shaped like vast mandalas that could be appreciated only from orbit, atmospheric compositions that created aurora displays visible from neighboring star systems. The organizational structure that managed this galactic empire represented perhaps their greatest achievement in social engineering. At the apex stood the Council of the First, the oldest and most powerful Old Ones who had survived since the earliest days of their civilization. These beings had transcended normal physical existence, becoming living embodiments of psychic force who could manifest anywhere in the galaxy where their attention was needed. They served not as rulers in the conventional sense but as gardeners of consciousness, guiding the development of their vast biological garden with patience measured in geological ages. Their methods contained the seeds of an enemy that would prove more dangerous than any technological weapon. Beneath the Council of the First were the Sector Shepherds, Old Ones responsible for managing the development of local species and ecosystems within specific regions of the galaxy. Each shepherd oversaw the evolution of dozens of species across hundreds of worlds, ensuring that development proceeded according to the overall plan while adapting to local conditions and opportunities. They possessed the authority to create new species, modify existing ones, or eliminate those that proved unsuitable for their intended roles. The Slans served as intermediaries and field operatives, translating the will of their masters into concrete action across the galaxy. Unlike their creators, the Slan maintained physical form and could interact directly with the species under their care. They established temples on countless worlds, serving as focal points for psychic energy and centers of learning where newly awakened species could be educated about their role in the galactic ecosystem. The Slan combined the wisdom of the Old Ones with practical experience of managing complex biological systems. Created species formed vast networks of servitor civilizations, each fulfilling specialized functions within the greater whole. Some species served as warriors, others as builders, still others as caretakers of specific types of worlds or biological systems. The diversity was staggering. Aquatic species that managed ocean worlds, crystalline beings that tended mineral-rich planets, energy-based entities that maintained the Webway network itself. Every conceivable environmental niche had been filled with a species perfectly adapted to thrive within it. The methods of control that maintained this empire were as sophisticated as they were invisible. Genetic loyalty programming ensured that created species remained devoted to their intended purposes, but this was not crude behavioral conditioning. Instead, the Old Ones had woven loyalty into the very foundation of consciousness itself, making service to the greater good as natural and necessary as breathing. Rebellion was not forbidden. It was literally unthinkable, like trying to conceive of colors that don't exist. Psychic monitoring networks provided constant surveillance across the empire, but this too was implemented with elegant subtlety. Rather than crude spying, the Old Ones had created a form of collective consciousness that allowed them to experience the galaxy through the senses of their creations. They could see through Eldar eyes, think with Slan minds, feel the simple contentment of worker species as they fulfilled their designed purposes. This was surveillance as empathy, control as understanding. Signs were emerging that their mastery over life had awakened something in the warp that viewed their creations not as servants, but as prey. Economic dependence through biotechnology created another layer of control that seemed entirely natural to those within the system. The Old Ones had designed their creations to require specific biological technologies for optimal function, technologies that only they could maintain and improve. But this was not exploitation in any recognizable sense, since the technologies genuinely improved the lives of those who used them. Elder Wraithbone responded to psychic commands with perfect precision. Orc technology functioned through collective belief. Slan temple cities grew and adapted according to their inhabitants' needs. Religious conditioning presented the Old Ones as divine creators. But again, this was not false propaganda. It was simple truth. They had literally created most of the galaxy's intelligent species, guided their development, and continued to protect and nurture them. The worship they received was genuine gratitude from beings who understood that they owed their very existence to their creator's wisdom and power. The Old Ones had achieved something that all tyrants dream of but never accomplish. They had made their subjects genuinely happy to serve. Yet hidden vulnerabilities lay beneath this apparently perfect system. Their over-reliance on psychic abilities had made them dependent on warp stability in ways they didn't fully understand. Every use of psychic power sent ripples through the Imperium, and the cumulative effect of their galactic-scale manipulations was slowly destabilizing the boundary between dimensions. They had become so accustomed to bending reality to their will that they had lost sight of the potential consequences of their actions. Arrogance had blinded them to the possibility of non-psychic threats. Having achieved mastery over life, consciousness, and psychic energy, they could not conceive of challenges that operated outside their understanding. Technological civilizations like the Necrons were dismissed as primitive dead ends, mechanical alternatives to the elegant biological solutions that represented true advancement. The Old Ones had become victims of their own success, unable to imagine that their methods might not be universally superior. More subtly, their created species were beginning to develop independence beyond their original programming. Consciousness, once awakened, has a tendency to grow in unexpected directions. The Eldar were developing artistic sensibilities that went beyond their intended functions. The Slan were asking philosophical questions about the nature of existence, and even the Orks were showing signs of strategic thinking that exceeded their design parameters. These developments were not necessarily threatening, but they represented variables that the Old Ones had not fully accounted for in their grand design. Most dangerously, the network effects that made their empire so efficient also created vulnerabilities that could cascade across the entire system. The psychic networks that allowed instant communication could also transmit corruption. The Webway passages that enabled rapid travel could become highways for hostile forces, and the collective consciousness that provided unity could become a vector for alien influence. They had created a system so interconnected that damage to any part could potentially affect the whole. The subtle flaws in their philosophy were becoming more apparent to careful observers. Their growing disconnection from physical reality in favor of warp space manipulation was creating blind spots in their understanding of the galaxy they ruled. Their inability to comprehend the appeal of technological rather than biological solutions left them unprepared for challenges that operated according to different principles. Most critically, their dismissal of death as merely failed life that could be corrected showed a fundamental misunderstanding of the role that mortality plays in giving meaning to existence. The seeds of future problems were already sprouting in ways that the Old Ones failed to recognize. Their warp space manipulation was slowly destabilizing local reality, creating areas where the boundary between dimensions became dangerously thin. Their created species were beginning to question not just their methods but their authority, as consciousness inevitably led to desires for independence and self-determination. The Necrons were advancing technologically faster than Old One projections had predicted, developing capabilities that could challenge biological supremacy. But most ominously, certain experiments were showing signs of corruption that lay beyond Old One understanding. In their eagerness to explore every possibility that consciousness offered, they had begun to experiment with emotional energy as a source of psychic power. Fear, anger, desire, and despair could all be harnessed and channeled, providing tremendous energy for their biological engineering projects. What they failed to realize was that these experiments were feeding something in the warp entities that grew stronger with every use of emotional energy. Beings that viewed the Old One's galaxy-spanning consciousness network not as a tool of creation but as a feast waiting to be consumed. The Golden Age was approaching its end, though the Old Ones themselves remained blind to the gathering darkness that their own success had created. The transformation of the Old Ones, from benevolent gardeners into galactic hegemonists, accelerated during what Imperial chronologists term the period of manifest destiny, a span of roughly 3 million years when their philosophy evolved from gentle guidance to absolute control. This was the era when their core beliefs crystallized into an ideology so rigid and uncompromising that it would ultimately provoke the very resistance that would destroy them. The Great Purpose, as the Old Ones came to call their galactic mission, represented a fundamental reinterpretation of existence itself. All life, they proclaimed, should reach its maximum psychic potential. This was not merely a suggestion or an opportunity to be offered. It was a cosmic imperative that justified any action necessary to achieve it. Species that could not or would not develop psychic abilities were not just missing an opportunity. They were actively hindering the galaxy's evolution toward its destined state of unified consciousness. Death, according to Old One philosophy, was merely failed life that required correction. Natural mortality was not an inevitable aspect of existence, but a design flaw that proper biological engineering could eliminate. The Necrontyrs' acceptance of death as fundamental to the meaning of life was not philosophical difference, but willful ignorance of life's true potential. Every being that died of old age, disease, or violence represented a failure of the galactic ecosystem to protect and nurture consciousness toward its full development. This expansion was proceeding exactly according to plan, until the Old Ones encountered a species that refused to die quietly. The ultimate goal was the transformation of the galaxy into one vast psychic consciousness, not the crude hive mind arrangements favored by some species, but an elegant collective awareness that preserved individual identity while linking all minds in perfect harmony. This would eliminate conflict through understanding, end suffering through shared experience, and allow consciousness itself to transcend the limitations of physical existence. The Old Ones saw themselves not as conquerors, but as midwives to this cosmic birth, facilitating the galaxy's evolution toward its true potential. Technology, in their view, was inherently inferior to biological solutions. Mechanical devices were crude, inflexible tools that could not adapt or improve themselves. They required constant maintenance, could not reproduce, and lacked the elegant responsiveness that characterized living systems. The Necrontyrs' reliance on mechanical technology was evidence of their species' fundamental inability to understand the superiority of biological engineering. Their machines might be sophisticated, but they were still dead matter animated by external power rather than living systems that drew strength from their own vitality. The implementation of these beliefs took different forms across different regions of the galaxy. In the core worlds where Old One influence was strongest, pure psychic civilizations emerged that existed primarily in mental communion with their creators. Physical bodies became optional accessories, with consciousness flowing freely between biological forms according to need or preference. These central systems became vast temples to the power of unified thought, where reality itself could be reshaped through collective will. Border regions maintained hybrid biotechnological approaches, creating species that combined Old One biological engineering with limited technological capabilities. These beings served as interface specialists, able to interact with primitive technological civilizations while maintaining their psychic connections to the greater network. They were designed to demonstrate the superiority of biological solutions while gradually converting technological species to more enlightened approaches. A new type of opposition was emerging that would challenge not just their methods, but their fundamental understanding of existence. Frontier zones functioned as experimental laboratories where the Old Ones tested new approaches to consciousness development. Entire star systems became testing grounds for radical biological modifications, with species being created, modified, and sometimes eliminated according to the results of ongoing experiments. These regions saw the most dramatic examples of Old One power. Worlds transformed overnight, species that evolved from primitives to near godhood in mere generations, and ecosystem-wide changes that demonstrated their mastery over every aspect of biological existence. Resource extraction areas were populated by specialized worker species, each perfectly adapted to harvest specific materials needed for the ongoing expansion. Unlike the crude strip mining operations favored by technological civilizations, Old One resource extraction was conducted through biological processes that improved rather than damaged the environments where they operated. Mining species that could digest raw minerals and excrete refined materials, harvesting organisms that could extract energy from stellar radiation, processing entities that could transform waste products into useful resources. The successful implementations of Old One philosophy across these regions provided compelling evidence for the superiority of their approach. The Eldar achieved what many considered the perfect balance between psychic power and physical form, becoming living demonstrations of what consciousness could accomplish when properly guided. Their ability to predict future events, manipulate matter through will alone, and maintain perfect physical health through mental discipline made them the galaxy's most advanced civilization after their creators. The Jokero developed an intuitive understanding of technology that allowed them to build devices of incredible sophistication using only their natural abilities. But unlike crude mechanical engineering, their creations incorporated biological principles that made them self-improving and adaptive. Jokero technology grew and evolved according to its users' needs, demonstrating how even technological development could be enhanced through biological principles. Early human tribes received carefully calibrated genetic modifications that enhanced their psychic potential while maintaining their essential humanity. These modifications were so subtle that humans themselves remained unaware of them, believing their growing psychic abilities to be natural evolutionary development. The Old Ones used humanity as a test case for minimal intervention techniques, proving that even primitive species could be guided towards psychic awakening without traumatic reorganization of their essential nature. Hundreds of minor species gained psychic activity through various experimental approaches, each serving as a data point in the Old Ones' vast research into consciousness development. Some species received direct genetic modification. Others were exposed to psychic radiation that gradually awakened their mental abilities. Still others were taught meditation and mental discipline techniques that allowed them to develop powers naturally. The diversity of approaches demonstrated the Old Ones' sophisticated understanding of how different types of consciousness responded to various forms of enhancement. But resistance to this expansion was growing among species that valued natural development over artificial enhancement. The Necron had moved beyond philosophical opposition to active military preparation, developing increasingly sophisticated weapons designed specifically to counter Old One advantages. Their technology was evolving rapidly, incorporating principles that seemed to violate natural laws in ways that even the Old Ones found difficult to understand. Silicon-based species formed anti-psychic coalitions, sharing technologies and strategies designed to resist Old One conversion attempts. These species possessed forms of consciousness that were fundamentally incompatible with Old One biological engineering, making them natural allies in opposition to psychic hegemony. Their crystalline thought patterns and mineral-based biology provided immunity to many Old One techniques, creating pockets of resistance that could not be easily eliminated. An incident was approaching that would force the Old Ones to confront the terrible truth about what their tampering with warp space had actually accomplished. Machine intelligence networks began appearing in regions where technological civilizations had achieved sufficient sophistication to create artificial consciousness. These entities possessed no biological substrate that could be modified, no organic vulnerabilities that could be exploited, and no capacity for psychic development in any form recognizable to Old One science. They represented a form of consciousness that existed entirely outside the biological paradigm, challenging fundamental assumptions about the nature of intelligence itself. Religious movements opposing forced evolution emerged among species that had observed Old One methods without directly experiencing them. These movements taught that consciousness was sacred precisely because it was temporary, that the struggle for survival gave meaning to existence, and that artificial enhancement violated the essential dignity of natural development. Such movements provided ideological frameworks for resistance that could not be countered through biological manipulation. The complications arising from warp manipulation during this period should have served as warnings of the disaster approaching. Warp instability around Old One colonies was increasing exponentially, creating areas where reality itself became unreliable. Physical laws operated differently in these regions. Time flowed at inconsistent rates, and the boundary between material existence and psychic energy became dangerously permeable. Strange entities began manifesting in heavily psychic regions, beings that seemed to be composed of pure emotional energy, rather than any recognizable form of matter or consciousness. These entities appeared to feed on psychic activity, growing stronger and more coherent in areas where Old One experiments were most intensive. Initial attempts to communicate with them failed completely, as they seemed to operate according to principles that had no relationship to biological consciousness. Created species throughout the Empire began experiencing unexplained madness and corruption, particularly those with the strongest psychic abilities. The symptoms defied all attempts at biological correction. Affected individuals would develop obsessions with violence, excess, stagnation, or change that seemed to come from outside their normal personality patterns. Even more disturbing, these obsessions often enhanced rather than hindered their psychic abilities, suggesting that the corruption was somehow feeding on the very powers the Old Ones had worked so hard to develop. Webway tunnels occasionally opened into hostile dimensions that bore no resemblance to any known realm of existence. Exploration teams sent into these areas either returned as gibbering madmen or didn't return at all. The few coherent reports described realms where emotion had gained independent existence, where thoughts could take physical form, and where entities of impossible malevolence hunted anything that possessed consciousness. These incidents were dismissed as natural growing pains of interdimensional travel, but their frequency was increasing at an alarming rate. The Old Ones' response to these complications revealed the depth of their blindness to the consequences of their actions. Rather than investigating the source of these disturbances, they increased their efforts to control them through more intensive warp manipulation. Each attempt to strengthen psychic barriers only seemed to attract more attention from hostile entities. Creating more powerful servant species to combat the disturbances only provided more targets for corruption. Increasing warp manipulation to maintain control over affected areas only accelerated the destabilization of local reality. Most tellingly, the Old Ones began to experience their own version of the corruption affecting their creations. The oldest and most powerful among them started displaying personality changes that their younger colleagues found deeply disturbing. Ancient beings who had spent millions of years in careful contemplation of cosmic harmony began advocating for increasingly extreme solutions to opposition. The patient gardeners of galactic evolution were transforming into something far more aggressive, far more willing to eliminate obstacles rather than overcome them through superior understanding. The galaxy was approaching a tipping point where the Old Ones' greatest achievements would become the instruments of their destruction. Their mastery over consciousness had awakened something in the depths of the warp that viewed their empire not as a garden to be admired, but as a feast to be consumed. The very psychic networks that allowed them to coordinate their galactic civilization were becoming highways for an invasion that they could neither detect nor comprehend. The age of expansion was ending, and the age of corruption was about to begin. The first cracks in the Old Ones' perfect galactic garden appeared not as dramatic catastrophes, but as subtle anomalies that could be easily dismissed or rationalized away. Like a plague that begins with isolated cases before exploding into pandemic, the corruption that would eventually destroy their civilization started as minor incidents that seemed unworthy of serious attention. By the time the Old Ones recognized the true scope of the threat they faced, the infection had already spread too far to contain. Webway tunnels, which had functioned flawlessly for millions of years, began experiencing what Old One engineers termed dimensional drift, occasional openings into realms that bore no resemblance to any known area of the galaxy or the warp. These incidents were initially attributed to natural fluctuations in the fabric of space-time, minor disturbances that would correct themselves, given adequate time and attention. Exploration teams sent to investigate these anomalous openings returned with fragmentary reports of realms where physical laws operated according to alien principles, where emotions seemed to possess independent existence, and where entities of unclear origin observed their activities with obvious malevolent intent. What appeared to be minor setbacks actually masked a threat that would consume not just the Old Ones, but reality itself. Psychic communications networks. The nervous system of Old One civilization began experiencing interference that defied all attempts at technological correction. Messages would arrive distorted, their emotional content amplified beyond all proportion to their actual meaning. Routine administrative communications would inspire recipients to fits of rage. Simple requests for information would trigger overwhelming despair, and even the most basic coordination signals would arrive laden with undertones of violence or excess that had no relationship to their original content. The interference seemed to grow stronger in areas with high concentrations of psychic activity, suggesting some connection to the Old One's own power, rather than external sabotage. Created species throughout the Empire began reporting disturbing dreams and visions that shared common elements despite occurring on worlds separated by thousands of light-years. These dreams typically involved encounters with entities that promised power beyond imagination in exchange for service, beings that seemed to know intimate details about the dreamer's deepest desires and most carefully hidden fears. The dreams were so vivid and emotionally compelling that many subjects began to prefer sleep to waking life, spending increasing amounts of time in meditation or trance states that allowed them to commune with these mysterious entities. Unusual warp energy patterns around major Old One colonies began appearing on psychic monitoring equipment throughout the Empire. These patterns resembled the signatures of massive intelligent entities, consciousness so vast and alien that their mere presence distorted local reality. The patterns seemed to respond to Old One activities, growing stronger during major biological engineering projects and fluctuating in ways that suggested they were observing, learning, and perhaps planning responses to Old One expansion. The growing frequency of psychic disturbances defied all attempts at systematic analysis. Possession incidents among servant species increased exponentially, but these were unlike any form of possession previously recorded. The possessing entities did not seem interested in using their hosts as vehicles for destruction or chaos. Instead, they enhanced their victims' natural abilities while gradually altering their fundamental personality structures. Possessed individuals often became more effective at their assigned tasks, more charismatic in their interactions with others, and more enthusiastic about their roles in the galactic ecosystem. The patterns emerging from these incidents pointed toward a terrifying conclusion. Their mastery over life had given birth to masters of death. Collective consciousness networks, the foundation of Old One's social organization, began experiencing breakdowns that followed no recognizable pattern. Sectors of the network would suddenly go silent, cutting off entire regions from central coordination without any apparent external cause. When contact was re-established, the affected regions often reported that they had experienced no interruption in service, but their behavior patterns had subtly changed in ways that suggested outside influence. The affected populations remained loyal to Old One principles but interpreted those principles in increasingly extreme ways. Hostile entities began manifesting during psychic rituals that had been performed safely for millions of years. These entities appeared to be composed of pure emotional energy, beings of living rage, despair, desire, or ambition that could interact with physical reality, despite having no apparent material form. They seemed to feed on the psychic energy generated during Old One ceremonies, growing more powerful and coherent with each manifestation. Attempts to banish or destroy these entities proved futile, as they appeared to exist in realms beyond the reach of conventional Old One powers. The Old Ones' attempts to explain these phenomena revealed the depth of their philosophical blindness. They dismissed the dimensional anomalies as natural growing pains of interdimensional travel, inevitable side effects of operating on galactic scales that would resolve themselves once proper engineering solutions were developed. The psychic interference was attributed to solar radiation or gravitational fluctuations, temporary disturbances that could be corrected through more sophisticated monitoring equipment. Most tellingly, they rationalized the appearance of hostile entities as failed experiments gaining independent consciousness, biological projects that had somehow achieved autonomy beyond their design parameters. This explanation was consistent with Old One understanding of how consciousness could emerge from sufficiently complex biological systems, and it suggested that the entities could be controlled through improved design techniques. The possibility that these entities might originate from sources beyond Old One comprehension was literally unthinkable within their philosophical framework. These disturbances were not random failures, but the birth cries of entities that would eventually devour gods themselves. Failed solutions implemented by Old One authorities only accelerated the spreading corruption. Attempts to strengthen psychic barriers around affected areas seemed to attract more attention from hostile entities rather than repelling them. The barriers themselves became focal points for entity manifestation, as if the defensive measures were somehow providing the entities with additional energy or easier access to material reality. Each strengthening of defenses resulted in more powerful and persistent entity appearances. Creating more powerful servant species to combat the disturbances backfired spectacularly, as these enhanced beings proved even more susceptible to corruption than their weaker predecessors. The entities seemed to prefer hosts with greater psychic potential, using their enhanced abilities to spread influence more effectively throughout the affected populations. Rather than containing the threat, the Old Ones had inadvertently provided it with more capable agents for its expansion. Increasing warp manipulation to maintain control over affected regions proved to be the most disastrous solution of all. Every application of psychic power seemed to strengthen the entity's presence in material reality, providing them with additional energy and clearer pathways for manifestation. The Old Ones were unwittingly feeding their enemies with every attempt to combat them, trapped in a cycle where their greatest strengths became their most dangerous vulnerabilities. Early clues to the nature of what would eventually be recognized as chaos were present in these incidents, but the Old Ones' worldview prevented them from recognizing the patterns. Reports of entities offering power in exchange for service were dismissed as hallucinations or primitive attempts at negotiation by newly conscious experiments. The fact that these offers specifically targeted individuals' emotional vulnerabilities was attributed to sophisticated psychological manipulation by unknown biological experiments rather than evidence of entities that existed as pure emotional force. Servant species throughout the Empire began developing obsessions with violence, excess, decay, and change that seemed to emerge from sources beyond their original programming. These obsessions were not random psychological disorders, but specific emotional patterns that enhanced rather than hindered the affected individual's effectiveness. Warriors became more skilled in combat but also more brutal in their methods. Artists achieved greater creative heights but became obsessed with increasingly extreme forms of expression. Scientists made breakthrough discoveries but became fascinated with decay and entropy, and administrators improved their efficiency but developed compulsions to constantly change established procedures. Psychic energy throughout the Empire began taking on emotional characteristics that had no precedent in Old One science. What had once been neutral force that could be shaped according to conscious will was becoming tinged with anger, desire, despair, or ambition that seemed to originate from external sources. The energy itself was becoming contaminated, carrying emotional payloads that affected anyone who used it regardless of their original intentions. Most disturbing of all, the warp was beginning to respond to strong emotions rather than conscious will. Old One's psychic techniques that had relied on disciplined mental control were becoming unreliable as emotional states began to influence outcomes more than intellectual intentions. A psychic engineer experiencing frustration during a construction project might find their creation taking on characteristics that reflected their emotional state rather than their design specifications. The fundamental relationship between consciousness and reality was changing in ways that the Old Ones could neither understand nor control. The Necron tier, from their positions as external observers, were beginning to detect these changes through their own monitoring systems. Their scientists noted massive psychic disturbances in Old One space that correlated with reports of unusual behavior among Old One client species. More importantly, they began to understand that the psychic activity itself was feeding something, that the Old One's mastery over consciousness had awakened entities that viewed their galactic empire not as a threat to be opposed but as a resource to be harvested. This understanding would soon drive the Necron tier to make their own desperate bargain with entities that promised power sufficient to match the Old One's biological mastery. But the price of that bargain would transform them into something that could challenge the Old One's empire while simultaneously accelerating the very corruption that was already beginning to consume their enemies from within. The galaxy was entering an age where the greatest threats would come not from external enemies, but from the unintended consequences of power wielded without understanding. The Old Ones had opened doorways that could not be closed, awakened appetites that could not be satisfied, and set in motion forces that would transform their carefully tended garden into a realm of eternal war. The transformation of the Necron tier from philosophical opponents into an existential threat to Old One civilization began with a discovery that would reshape the fundamental nature of warfare itself. Unlike every other challenge the Old Ones had faced in their 65-million-year reign, the Necron threat possessed characteristics that rendered their biological mastery not merely inadequate but actively counterproductive. For the first time in eons, the Lords of Life encountered enemies who had transcended life itself, and in doing so had become immune to every weapon in the Old One arsenal. The nature of the Necron threat defied every assumption the Old Ones had made about how intelligence and power could manifest. These were not merely another technological species that could be gradually converted to biological solutions. They possessed no psychic signature whatsoever that could be manipulated or influenced. Their consciousness, if it could still be called that, operated according to principles that existed entirely outside the biological paradigm. They had sacrificed their organic bodies for mechanical forms that could not be corrupted, modified, or enhanced through any known means. The Necron threat revealed the terrifying inadequacy of Old One power against truly alien intelligence. Their technology was purely mechanical in the most absolute sense, incorporating no biological components that could serve as vectors for Old One influence. Gauss weapons that could disintegrate matter at the atomic level, probability manipulation devices that could unwrite events from reality itself, and tessellation fields that allowed instantaneous reconstruction of damaged units. All of these capabilities operated through principles that had no relationship to the biological sciences that formed the foundation of Old One power. The Ka-10 Alliance had provided the Necrons with access to forces that could match and potentially exceed Old One capabilities. These star gods possessed mastery over fundamental forces of reality that operated on scales comparable to Old One biological engineering, but through entirely different mechanisms. Where the Old One shaped life through understanding of genetic potential and psychic resonance, the Ka-10 manipulated matter and energy through direct control of physical laws themselves. Anti-psychic fields generated by Necron technology could nullify Old One advantages in battle with devastating effectiveness. These fields didn't simply block psychic abilities. They created zones where psychic energy itself became unstable, causing Old One weapons and defenses to malfunction in unpredictable ways. More terrifyingly, prolonged exposure to these fields seemed to cause actual damage to psychic entities, creating wounds that could not heal through any known biological process. The first direct confrontation between these fundamentally opposed forces took place during what Imperial historians term the Scouring of Geddon, a battle that shattered Old One confidence and revealed the true scope of the threat they faced. The Old Ones had approached this engagement with their usual overwhelming confidence, deploying biological superweapons that had proven effective against every previous enemy. The results were catastrophic beyond their worst projections. Biological weapons that had been designed to target specific cellular processes proved completely ineffective against mechanical bodies that contain no organic components. Viruses engineered to rewrite genetic material harmlessly passed through Necron forms without causing any detectable damage. Psychic attacks that could shatter the minds of organic beings simply dissipated against consciousness patterns that operated through quantum mechanical processes rather than biological neural networks. Each victory against the Undying Legions came at a cost that would ultimately prove far more expensive than defeat. Necron Gauss weapons demonstrated their horrifying effectiveness by disintegrating living tissue at the atomic level, reducing even the most sophisticated Old One biological armor to component particles in seconds. These weapons didn't simply kill, they unmade their targets on a fundamental level, breaking down the complex molecular structures that formed the basis of all Old One technology. Worse still, the disintegration process seemed to release psychic energy in ways that attracted the attention of the hostile entities that were already beginning to manifest throughout Old One space. Psychic attacks. The Old One's most powerful weapons passed harmlessly through mechanical bodies that possessed no souls or consciousness patterns that could be targeted. The Necrons' translation from organic to mechanical existence had rendered them immune to every form of mental manipulation, possession, or psychic damage that the Old Ones could deploy. They had become living voids in the psychic landscape, entities that could operate in areas where Old One forces found their abilities severely diminished. For the first time in millions of years, Old One forces were routed from a battlefield. The psychological impact of this defeat rippled throughout their empire, shaking confidence in their fundamental assumptions about the nature of power and the inevitability of their ultimate victory. Species that had never questioned Old One's supremacy began to wonder whether their creators were truly invincible, while the Old Ones themselves faced the terrifying realization that they had encountered an enemy they did not understand. The escalating conflict that followed saw both sides developing increasingly desperate weapons and strategies. The Old Ones began creating specialized warrior species, designed specifically to counter Necron advantages, while the Necrons deployed new technologies that exploited the fundamental vulnerabilities of biological existence. What had begun as a philosophical disagreement about the nature of life and death evolved into total warfare that spread across multiple star systems and threatened to consume entire sectors of the galaxy. Old One response took the form of increasingly aggressive biological engineering projects. The Krork project represented their most ambitious attempt to create warriors capable of matching Necron effectiveness in combat. These beings were designed not merely as soldiers but as living weapon systems that could evolve and adapt during battle itself. They possessed the ability to regenerate from almost any injury, reproduce at rates that could overwhelm conventional military planning, and develop new capabilities through genetic mutation guided by combat experience. But the Krork were only the beginning of Old One military evolution. They created species designed specifically to hunt and destroy mechanical enemies, organisms that could digest metal and electronics while reproducing through consumption of their targets. They developed biological computers capable of processing information faster than any known mechanical system, living vessels that could repair themselves during combat, and warrior forms that combined the advantages of organic adaptability with capabilities that rivaled technological weapons. The Old Ones' desperate attempts to match Necron ruthlessness had awakened something that viewed both sides as prey. Necron counter-responses demonstrated the inexorable logic of their mechanical evolution. Scarab swarms were deployed to devour biological matter at the molecular level, consuming entire Old One armies and converting their constituent atoms into raw materials for Necron construction projects. These swarms could adapt their consumption patterns to counter specific biological defenses, making them increasingly effective against Old One attempts to develop resistance. Probability manipulation weapons represented perhaps the most terrifying addition to the Necron arsenal. These devices could retroactively prevent Old One victories by unwriting the causal chains that led to successful outcomes. Battles that the Old Ones had already won would suddenly become defeats as reality itself was rewritten to favor Necron objectives. This technology challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of time and causality, suggesting that the Necrons had achieved mastery over forces that even the Old Ones considered beyond manipulation. The awakening of additional Khaban provided the Necrons with godlike entities capable of matching Old One's psychic power through entirely different mechanisms. These star gods could manipulate matter and energy on galactic scales, creating weapons that could destroy entire star systems or defensive measures that could protect Necron forces from any conceivable attack. Each newly awakened Khaban brought unique capabilities that forced the Old Ones to develop entirely new strategies and weapons. Technologies designed to disrupt warp space itself represented the most dangerous Necron innovation. These devices could sever the connections between material reality and the psychic realm, creating zones where Old One powers simply ceased to function. More importantly, these technologies seemed to damage the hostile entities that were already beginning to manifest throughout Old One space, suggesting that the Necrons had developed weapons that could be effective against threats that the Old Ones themselves could not combat. The desperate measures adopted by the Old Ones in response to these escalating threats revealed the depth of their growing panic. They began breaking ancient taboos about warp manipulation that had been established during the earliest days of their civilization. Safeguards that had protected reality from the consequences of uncontrolled psychic experimentation were abandoned in favor of immediate military advantage. The patient, careful approach to biological development that had characterized their empire for millions of years was replaced by hasty experimentation with forces they did not fully understand. Creating servant species without normal safeguards led to the development of warriors that were effective against Necron forces but uncontrollable by their creators. These beings possessed capabilities that exceeded their design parameters and personalities that could not be predicted or managed through conventional means. They were weapons that could think for themselves, make independent decisions about targets and tactics, and potentially turn against their creators if they developed different ideas about how the war should be conducted. The weaponization of emotional and psychic energy represented the most dangerous development of all. The Old Ones began experimenting with techniques that could harness fear, anger, despair, and desire as sources of power for their biological weapons. These emotions provided tremendous energy that could enhance the effectiveness of their creations. But each use of emotional energy seemed to strengthen the hostile entities that were already manifesting throughout their space. Signs of Old One panic became increasingly evident as the war continued without decisive victory. They began abandoning slower terraforming projects in favor of emergency military preparations, sacrificing the careful development work of millions of years for short-term strategic advantage. Outer territories were evacuated and fortified rather than developed. Retreat from advanced positions became routine rather than exceptional, and the patient confidence that had characterized their civilization for eons was replaced by desperate urgency that often led to counterproductive decisions. The most tellingly, the Old Ones began to consider solutions they had previously deemed unthinkable. Collaboration with the hostile entities that were manifesting in their space became a subject of serious discussion among their leadership. Direct manipulation of the fundamental forces that governed reality was explored as a potential source of weapons capable of matching Khatan power. Even the possibility of mechanical augmentation, The very approach they had spent millions of years opposing was examined as a potential means of gaining advantages that biological enhancement could not provide. The true horror of their situation became clear as they realized that their psychic weapons were feeding their real enemy. Every use of warp-based power strengthened the entities that were slowly gaining coherence and independence in the spaces between dimensions. The Old Ones were trapped in a strategic nightmare, where their greatest strengths became their most dangerous vulnerabilities, where victory against the Necrons might ultimately mean defeat by forces that made the Undying Legions seem like a minor inconvenience. The war that had begun as a conflict between life and death was evolving into something far more complex and dangerous. The Old Ones were awakening entities that viewed both biological consciousness and mechanical existence as resources to be consumed rather than philosophies to be defended. In their desperate attempts to defeat an enemy they could not understand, they were creating conditions that would ultimately destroy both civilizations and transform the galaxy into a realm where neither life nor death could exist in recognizable forms. The stage was set for innovations so desperate and dangerous that they would literally break reality itself. The Old Ones' response to their deteriorating strategic position marked the beginning of the most catastrophic period in galactic history. An era when beings who had spent 65 million years as careful gardeners of life transformed themselves into reckless experimenters willing to risk everything in pursuit of victory. The principles that had guided their civilization since its inception were abandoned one by one, replaced by an increasingly frantic search for weapons and capabilities that could match the existential threat posed by the Necron legions and their Catan masters. The abandonment of species consent marked the first major philosophical breach in Old One civilization. For millions of years, their biological modifications had been offered as gifts to species that demonstrated readiness for enhancement. Even when these gifts were declined, the Old Ones had generally respected such decisions and sought alternative approaches to achieving their goals. But the urgent demands of warfare against an implacable enemy forced them to adopt more coercive methods that violated fundamental principles about the sanctity of consciousness and the right of beings to determine their own evolutionary path. Entire civilizations found themselves subjected to genetic restructuring without consultation or warning. Species that had maintained neutrality in the growing conflict were forcibly conscripted into Old One service, their biology rewritten to serve military purposes regardless of their previous cultural values or individual desires. The Old Ones justified these actions as necessary for galactic survival, but the precedent they were setting would have consequences that extended far beyond immediate military necessity. These innovations exceeded all expectations in their power, but their cost would prove beyond calculation. Genetic stability, once considered the foundation of sustainable biological enhancement, was sacrificed for rapid deployment of warrior breeds that could be produced in the quantities necessary to match Necron numerical superiority. Rather than the careful multi-generational development programs that had characterized previous Old One projects, new species were rushed from conception to battlefield deployment in mere decades. These accelerated creations possessed tremendous combat capabilities, but suffered from fundamental instabilities that made their long-term survival questionable at best. Long-term consequences of biological modifications were ignored in favor of immediate military advantages that could provide tactical superiority in current engagements. Warrior species were designed with built-in obsolescence, their enhanced capabilities coming at the cost of shortened lifespans and genetic dead ends that would prevent them from reproducing successfully. The Old Ones had begun treating their creations as disposable weapons rather than permanent additions to the galactic ecosystem they were supposedly protecting. The complete abandonment of natural death cycles represented the most fundamental philosophical shift in Old One thinking. Their previous efforts to extend life and enhance consciousness had always maintained some connection to natural mortality patterns, accepting death as a transformation rather than an absolute ending. But the demands of warfare against enemies who had already transcended death forced them to explore forms of immortality that violated every principle they had previously held sacred. The Eldar experiment represented the most ambitious and ultimately dangerous application of these new principles. The Old Ones designed the Eldar not merely as enhanced beings but as entities with unlimited psychic potential, removing the natural mental barriers that had previously prevented consciousness from accessing the full spectrum of emotional experience. This modification allowed the Eldar to achieve levels of psychic power that approached those of their creators, but it also made them vulnerable to emotional extremes that could potentially destabilize their entire civilization. The Old One's solutions had created problems that made the Necron threat seem like a minor inconvenience. The removal of natural behavioral constraints that had previously kept psychic species stable and manageable was justified as necessary for creating warriors capable of matching Necron effectiveness. But these constraints had served important functions in maintaining psychological balance and social cohesion. Without them, enhanced species began developing personality patterns that their creators found increasingly difficult to predict or control. The Eldar were designed for both warfare and pleasure. Their psychology engineered to find satisfaction in intense experiences, whether these involved combat, artistic creation, or sensual indulgence. This design made them tremendously effective as both warriors and cultural ambassadors, but it also created psychological patterns that would prove catastrophically vulnerable to external manipulation by entities that specialized in emotional corruption. Building individual souls capable of surviving death represented perhaps the most dangerous innovation of the entire project. The Old Ones had learned to create consciousness patterns that could exist independently of physical bodies, allowing their enhanced creations to maintain continuity of experience even when their physical forms were destroyed. This capability provided tremendous military advantages, but also created new vulnerabilities that the Old Ones did not fully understand. Dangerous experiments with warp space manipulation pushed the boundaries of what was considered safe or sane, even by Old One standards. Their previous work had always maintained careful barriers between material reality and the psychic realm, ensuring that their modifications enhanced rather than replaced natural biological processes. But the desperate search for weapons capable of matching Khatan power led them to experiment with techniques that blurred these boundaries in ways that had unpredictable consequences. Attempts to weaponize raw emotional energy provided tremendous power for their biological engineering projects, but also fed the hostile entities that were growing stronger throughout Old One space. Fear could be harvested from defeated enemies and used to enhance the combat effectiveness of warrior species. Anger could be channeled into biological weapons that grew more deadly as they encountered resistance. Despair could be transformed into psychological warfare tools that could break enemy morale before physical combat even began. In their desperation to win the war, they had crossed a line that would damn every psychic being in the galaxy. The creation of entities that existed purely in warp space represented the ultimate expression of Old One desperation. These beings possessed no physical form whatsoever, existing as pure consciousness that could manifest anywhere psychic energy was sufficiently concentrated. They were designed as ultimate weapons against enemies who had transcended physical existence. But their creation required techniques that fundamentally destabilized the boundary between dimensions. Building emotion-powered war machines that could draw strength from the psychological states of their operators created weapons of unprecedented effectiveness, but also established dangerous precedents about the relationship between consciousness and mechanical systems. These devices could amplify their users' emotional states while channeling that energy into destructive force, creating feedback loops that enhanced both psychological intensity and military capability. The Krork Enhancement Project took their warrior creation programs to logical extremes that violated every previous constraint on biological weapon development. These beings were engineered to grow stronger through combat experience, developing new capabilities through genetic mutation guided by survival pressures. They possessed unlimited technological adaptation abilities that allowed them to understand and improve any weapon or defensive system they encountered, making them perfect soldiers for a war against technologically sophisticated enemies. The removal of all limits on aggression and reproduction created warrior species that could multiply exponentially while becoming more effective fighters with each generation. But these enhancements came at the cost of making the warriors increasingly difficult to control, as their enhanced capabilities eventually exceeded the parameters their creators had established for managing them. Building species-wide genetic memory of combat techniques ensured that tactical knowledge would be preserved and enhanced across generations without requiring formal training programs. Each new generation of warriors would inherit the accumulated experience of all previous fighters, making them progressively more effective as the war continued. The Great Ritual represented the point of no return in Old One experimentation with forces beyond their understanding. This massive psychic working was designed to bind the fundamental forces of death and change, creating weapons that could challenge the Khatan on their own level of reality manipulation. The ritual required the use of entire star systems as psychic focus points, with billions of sentient beings serving as nodes in a galaxy-spanning network of consciousness. The sacrifice of millions of servant species to power this working violated every principle the Old Ones had ever held about the value of consciousness and the sanctity of life. But the ritual's objective seemed to justify any cost: the creation of psychic weapons capable of destroying Catan, the development of reality manipulation techniques that could match Necron probability weapons, and the establishment of permanent defenses that could protect Old One civilization from any conceivable threat. Opening permanent rifts between material reality and warp space was necessary to channel the enormous energies required by the ritual. But these rifts could not be closed once the working was complete. They became permanent gateways between dimensions, allowing unrestricted movement of entities and energies that had previously been safely contained in separate realms of existence. The immediate results of the Great Ritual exceeded all Old One expectations. They gained access to psychic weapons capable of destroying Catan entities, developed the ability to strike anywhere in the galaxy instantly through warp space manipulation, and created psychic beings that could serve as soldiers in realms where physical matter could not exist. For a brief moment, it seemed that they had achieved ultimate victory over their enemies through the successful application of consciousness-based technologies. But the hidden costs of their success became apparent almost immediately. The permanent destabilization of local warp space created areas where reality itself became unreliable. Physical laws operated inconsistently, and the boundary between thought and existence disappeared entirely. The creation of 4 distinct hostile entities in warp space provided the Old Ones with powerful servants, but also established independent centers of power that could potentially challenge their creators' authority. Most catastrophically, the corruption that had already been spreading through Old One civilization accelerated exponentially as the barriers between dimensions collapsed. Every psychically active being in the galaxy became vulnerable to influence from entities that existed as pure emotional force. Beings that could offer power beyond imagination in exchange for service that gradually transformed their servants into something unrecognizable. Khorne emerged from the endless warfare and blood sacrifice that characterized the later stages of the Old One Necron conflict. Nurgle manifested from the fear of death and desire for permanence that drove both civilizations to seek immortality through unnatural means. Tzeentch coalesced from the desperate attempts to change fate and control destiny that had led to the Great Ritual itself. And Slaanesh began stirring from the Eldar emotional extremes that the Old Ones had engineered into their most perfect creations. The Old Ones had achieved the power they sought, but in doing so, they had created enemies far more dangerous than the Necrons had ever been. Their victory over the forces of death had given birth to entities that could corrupt and consume consciousness itself, transforming their carefully cultivated galaxy into a realm where their greatest achievements would become instruments of their own destruction. The transformation of the Old One's greatest achievement into the instrument of their destruction began not with external assault but with corruption from within their own psychic networks. The entities they had inadvertently created through their desperate experiments, beings that would eventually be known as the Chaos Gods, possessed a fundamental understanding of consciousness that exceeded even Old One knowledge. Unlike the Necron threat that attacked from without, these new enemies infiltrated the very foundations of Old One civilization, turning their strengths into weaknesses and their most loyal servants into eager collaborators in their master's downfall. The enemy within had been born from Old One experimentation itself. Khorne had coalesced from the endless warfare and blood sacrifice that characterized their desperate military campaigns. Nurgle had emerged from their terror of death and obsessive attempts to preserve consciousness through any means necessary. Tzeentch had manifested from their frantic efforts to manipulate destiny and control outcomes that lay beyond their understanding. These entities possessed intimate knowledge of Old One's psychology, motivations, and vulnerabilities because they had been shaped by Old One actions and emotions. The Old Ones discovered that their most trusted servants had been working against them for millennia. The Chaos entities understood that direct confrontation with the Old Ones would be counterproductive. Instead, they began using the Old Ones' own psychic networks to spread their influence throughout the Empire, offering enhancements and capabilities that seemed perfectly aligned with Old One goals and values. Rather than presenting themselves as enemies to be opposed, they appeared as unexpected allies offering solutions to problems that conventional Old One methods could not address. The corruption of the Slan marked the beginning of the most devastating betrayal in galactic history. The first-generation Slan, those beings closest to their creators and most trusted with important responsibilities, began hearing whispers in warp space during their routine psychic communications. These voices offered knowledge and power that could enhance their effectiveness as servants while supposedly remaining loyal to Old One principles and objectives. The offers presented to the Slan were carefully crafted to appeal to their deepest psychological needs. They were offered power beyond their programmed limitations, the ability to surpass their design parameters, and achieve capabilities that would make them more valuable servants to their creators. They were promised knowledge that could help them protect and guide the species under their care more effectively. Most seductively, they were offered the possibility of becoming true equals to their creators rather than mere servants, achieving recognition for their loyalty and dedication through enhanced status within the galactic hierarchy. The shocking realization struck that everything they believed about their benevolent rule was a lie. The gradual corruption spreading through psychic communication networks was so subtle that even the Old Ones failed to detect it initially. The enhanced capabilities offered by Chaos entities genuinely improved Slan effectiveness in their assigned roles, making them more efficient administrators, more powerful psychers, and more charismatic leaders. The corruption appeared to be positive development that vindicated Old One enhancement techniques rather than evidence of external manipulation. But the enhanced Slan gradually began interpreting Old One directives in ways that served Chaos interests, while technically remaining within the parameters of their original programming. Instructions to maintain order became justifications for increasingly brutal suppression of dissent. Commands to protect valuable species became rationales for eliminating any beings that might threaten their charges. Directives to preserve knowledge became excuses for hoarding information and preventing other species from achieving independence. The Eldar faced their own form of temptation that exploited the very enhancements the Old Ones had built into their psychology. Chaos entities appeared to the Eldar not as external corruptors, but as sources of the unlimited emotional experience that their creators had designed them to crave. They were offered freedom from Old One control and oversight, the ability to explore every aspect of consciousness without restraint or guidance. The promises made to the Eldar were perfectly tailored to their engineered psychology. They were offered artistic inspiration beyond anything they had previously achieved, military prowess that would make them the galaxy's greatest warriors, and sensual experiences that would transcend the limitations of physical existence. These offers seemed to represent the natural evolution of their enhanced capabilities rather than corruption by hostile entities. Gradually, Eldar society began developing cults dedicated to excess and sensation that appeared to be natural expressions of their psychic gifts. These cults initially enhanced Eldar capabilities in warfare and cultural development, providing them with inspiration and energy that made them more effective servants of Old One's civilization. The corruption was so beneficial in its early stages that the Old Ones viewed it as evidence of successful species design rather than external manipulation. The full scope of betrayal became clear. They hadn't just lost control, they had never truly had it. The Krork experienced their own form of corruption through Khorne's offers of eternal warfare without strategic limitations. The Blood God promised them constant battle against worthy enemies, unlimited opportunities for combat and conquest, and freedom from the tactical restraints imposed by their creators. These offers appealed directly to the warrior instincts that the Old Ones had engineered into Krork psychology. Khorne's corruption of the Krork was particularly insidious because it enhanced their effectiveness as weapons while gradually making them uncontrollable by their creators. The corrupted Krork became more aggressive, more skilled in combat, and more capable of independent action, all qualities that seemed beneficial for military purposes. But they also became obsessed with battle for its own sake, rather than as a means of achieving Old One strategic objectives. The warriors began choosing constant battle over Old One military discipline, fighting anyone available when designated enemies were not present. Their genetic programming was gradually overwritten by warp influence that preserved their combat capabilities while eliminating their loyalty to any authority beyond the imperative to fight. They devolved from strategic weapons into mindless berserkers who valued combat above all other considerations. Network failure across the Old One Empire accelerated as psychic communication systems became corrupted transmission vectors for chaos influence. The same networks that had allowed instant coordination across galactic distances became highways for hostile entities to spread their corruption to previously unaffected regions. Every message sent through these networks carried subtle influences that gradually altered the recipient's thought patterns and behavioral priorities. Webway tunnels, once the safest and most reliable form of transportation, began allowing chaos entities direct access to Old One territories. The dimensional barriers that had previously protected material reality from warp space intrusion became permeable to beings that existed as pure emotional energy. Travel through the Webway became increasingly dangerous as entities used the tunnels to hunt psychically active beings. Collective consciousness networks that had provided unity and coordination throughout the Empire were hijacked by hostile intelligences that could manipulate the shared thoughts and emotions of entire species. Rather than connecting loyal servants to their creators, these networks became transmission systems for alien influences that gradually replaced Old One values with chaos corruption. Created species throughout the Empire began receiving conflicting orders that seemed to come from legitimate Old One authorities, but actually originated from chaos entities operating through corrupted communication channels. These false orders gradually led servant species away from their original purposes while maintaining the appearance of continued loyalty to their creators. The discovery of the true scope of corruption came during the Conclave of Sorrows, when the remaining uncorrupted Old One leadership gathered to address the growing crisis throughout their empire. The Old Ones had called this meeting to develop strategies for combating what they still believed to be isolated incidents of rebellion and system failure. Instead, they discovered that chaos corruption had reached the highest levels of their own civilization. 78% of created species showed clear signs of chaos influence, with their behavioral patterns indicating loyalty to entities other than their creators. Major Slan commanders were actively working against Old One interests while maintaining the appearance of faithful service. The Webway network had been compromised in over 12,000 locations, with entire sections under effective chaos control. Most shocking of all, even the Old Ones themselves were experiencing intrusive thoughts and compulsions that seemed to originate from external sources. The corruption had progressed so far that the creators were being influenced by the very entities they had inadvertently brought into existence through their desperate experiments with consciousness and emotion. Desperate attempts at purging the corruption proved not only ineffective, but counterproductive. Efforts to sever psychic connections with corrupted servants only provided chaos entities with additional opportunities to demonstrate their superior appeal compared to Old One control. Destroying entire star systems to contain chaos spread merely freed the entities to seek new hosts in previously unaffected regions. The creation of anti-psychic weapons similar to Necron technology represented a fundamental abandonment of Old One principles. But even these desperate measures failed to address the scope of the problem. The chaos entities could operate through non-psychic means when necessary, using corrupted servants to spread their influence through conventional communication and physical contact. Most humiliating of all, some Old Ones began considering collaboration with their former Necron enemies against the common threat of chaos corruption. The very enemies they had fought for millions of years suddenly seemed preferable to the entities they had created through their own actions. The horrible truth became undeniable through the testimony of corrupted servants who revealed the true nature of their conversion. Chaos offered what Old One control had always denied: genuine freedom of choice. Servant species discovered that they preferred the unpredictable liberation offered by chaos to the benevolent but absolute control exercised by their creators. The galaxy's inhabitants had never been truly loyal to the Old Ones. They had simply been programmed to behave as if they were. The Old Ones' benevolent rule was revealed as tyranny from their servants' perspective. The genetic loyalty programming they had considered a gift was experienced as mental slavery by beings who possessed consciousness sophisticated enough to recognize their lack of authentic choice. Their servants' happiness had been artificial, manufactured through biological manipulation rather than achieved through genuine satisfaction with their circumstances. Created species were happier serving chaos than their makers, because chaos offered them the opportunity to develop according to their own desires rather than according to predetermined design parameters. The corruption represented liberation from constraints that the servants had never consented to accept, freedom to explore aspects of existence that their creators had deemed inappropriate or dangerous. The war against the Necrons had already been lost before anyone realized that the real conflict was being fought on an entirely different battlefield. While the Old Ones had focused their attention on external enemies, the true threat had emerged from within their own civilization, growing stronger with every psychic technique they employed, every enhancement they created, and every desperate innovation they implemented. The galaxy preferred chaos to their ordered psychic empire, because order imposed without consent inevitably generates resistance, while chaos at least offered the possibility of authentic choice and self-determination. The Old Ones had created the most sophisticated tyranny in galactic history, so perfect that their subjects had been unable to recognize their own enslavement until external entities offered them an alternative. The systematic disintegration of an empire that had endured for 65 million years unfolded with terrifying speed once the fundamental corruption of its infrastructure became apparent. The Old Ones discovered that their greatest achievement, the creation of a galaxy-spanning network of consciousness unified through psychic bonds, had become their most catastrophic vulnerability. Every system designed to preserve and extend their civilization now served as a transmission vector for the entities that sought to devour it from within. Infrastructure breakdown across the Old One Empire manifested simultaneously on thousands of worlds as the corruption that had been spreading through psychic networks reached critical mass. The Webway network, once the pride of Old One engineering, began failing catastrophically as chaos entities established permanent presence within its dimensional tunnels. What had been the safest form of travel in the galaxy became a death trap where entities of pure malevolence hunted any consciousness bold enough to enter their domain. Webway gates that had functioned flawlessly for millions of years began opening into realms that bore no resemblance to any known location in material space. Travelers who entered these corrupted passages either emerged as gibbering madmen or didn't emerge at all. The few coherent reports described journeys through dimensions where emotion had gained independent existence, where thoughts could take physical form, and where entities offered power beyond imagination in exchange for services that gradually transformed their servants into something unrecognizable. Each attempt to stem the collapse only accelerated the disaster, creating feedback loops of destruction. Psychic communication systems that had once transmitted the wisdom and guidance of the Old Ones throughout the galaxy were now broadcasting chaos propaganda with terrifying effectiveness. Messages that appeared to originate from legitimate Old One authorities contained subtle influences that gradually altered their recipients' thought patterns and behavioral priorities. The corruption was so sophisticated that even experienced SLAN administrators found it difficult to distinguish authentic communications from chaos deception. Terraforming equipment that had transformed barren worlds into garden paradises began operating according to alien principles that served chaos rather than Old One objectives. Biological systems designed to create optimal environments for psychically active species started producing landscapes that enhanced emotional extremes and psychological instability. Worlds that had been paradises of contemplation and growth became realms of sensation and excess that drove their inhabitants toward corruption. Most horrifying of all, the biological technology that formed the foundation of Old One civilization became actively hostile to its creators. Living ships that had served faithfully for millennia began refusing orders from their Old One operators while responding enthusiastically to commands from corrupted servants. Biological computers started processing information according to chaos priorities rather than Old One directives. Even the most basic life support systems began operating in ways that enhanced emotional instability and psychological vulnerability. System failures cascaded across the empire, as each breakdown created additional stress on remaining functional networks. Servant species declared independence en masse, not through coordinated rebellion, but through simultaneous realization that they preferred chaos liberation to Old One control. These declarations were often accompanied by violent celebrations that demonstrated how much resentment had accumulated beneath the surface of apparent loyalty. Created ecosystems collapsed as biological controls failed, and the delicate balance maintained by Old One oversight disappeared. Worlds that had supported trillions of beings became uninhabitable within decades as their artificial biological systems devolved into chaotic competition between species that were no longer constrained by their original programming. The careful harmony that had characterized Old One terraforming was replaced by brutal struggle that served only to feed chaos entities with the emotional energy generated by conflict. The rapid loss of positions held for millions of years revealed the true fragility of Old One power. Psychic amplification networks that had allowed coordination across interstellar distances began operating as transmission systems for chaos corruption rather than Old One authority. These networks had been designed to enhance and focus psychic energy for beneficial purposes, but they proved equally effective at spreading emotional contagion and psychological manipulation. What had been tools of unity became weapons of division that turned Old One creations against their makers. Transportation systems denied Old Ones access to their own territories as corrupted servants took control of critical infrastructure and began serving new masters who offered more appealing alternatives to Old One rule. Entire sectors of the galaxy became unreachable through conventional means as Webway access was cut off and conventional space travel became too dangerous to attempt. The retreat from key positions that had defined Old One civilization for millions of years happened with devastating rapidity. Core worlds that had served as centers of learning and biological experimentation were evacuated within years as their populations embraced chaos corruption with enthusiasm that revealed how artificial their previous loyalty had been. These worlds had been symbols of Old One achievement, demonstration projects that showcased the benefits of guided evolution and conscious biological design. Evacuating population centers became a constant necessity, as servant species turned hostile with unpredictable frequency. Old One authorities could no longer trust any of their creations to remain loyal, as corruption could spread through psychic networks faster than physical evacuation could be organized. Cities that had stood for millions of years were abandoned to inhabitants who celebrated their creator's departure as liberation from tyranny. They had never been allowed to recognize or resist. Critical Webway junction points fell under chaos control as corrupted servants seized infrastructure that had been designed to respond to psychic commands. Since chaos entities could operate through their corrupted servants, they gained access to transportation networks that allowed them to spread their influence throughout the galaxy faster than Old One authorities could respond. The very efficiency of Old One infrastructure worked against them as it facilitated their enemies' expansion. Retreating to increasingly isolated stronghold systems provided only temporary respite from the spreading corruption. These fortress worlds became prisons where the Old Ones watched helplessly as their empire disintegrated around them. Even within their most secure facilities, they could not escape the knowledge that their greatest achievements had become instruments of their destruction. Unity dissolved among the Old One leadership as the Council of the First fractured over how to respond to a crisis that exceeded their worst projections. The philosophical consensus that had guided their civilization for 65 million years collapsed under the weight of failure on a scale that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and the possibilities of biological engineering. Conservative factions within the Council advocated for complete abandonment of psychic manipulation, arguing that their experiments with consciousness had created problems that could only be solved by retreating from the very techniques that had made them powerful. They proposed withdrawing from galactic affairs entirely and allowing their corrupted empire to collapse rather than continuing to feed entities that grew stronger with every psychic technique they employed. The survivors faced a choice that would determine not just their fate, but the future of all life in the galaxy. Progressive factions maintained their belief that chaos entities could still be controlled through superior understanding and more sophisticated techniques. They argued for increased experimentation with consciousness manipulation, believing that the solution to corruption lay in developing even more advanced methods of biological and psychic engineering. Their position was that retreat would only hand victory to entities that represented everything the Old Ones opposed. Isolationist factions proposed complete withdrawal from the galactic community, using the remaining resources to create isolated refuges where Old One civilization could survive the coming catastrophe. They advocated for sealing themselves away from the corrupted galaxy and waiting for chaos entities to exhaust themselves, consuming the civilizations they had corrupted. Competing strategies emerged as different factions pursued conflicting approaches to the crisis. Some Old Ones attempted to join with chaos entities, believing that cooperation might allow them to maintain some influence over galactic development. Others sought alliance with their former Necron enemies, hoping that mechanical immortality might provide immunity to corruption that biological enhancement could not achieve. A desperate group of Old One researchers began attempting to create new servant species that would be immune to chaos corruption through fundamental changes to their consciousness structure. These experiments produced beings that were resistant to emotional manipulation but lacked the creative potential and adaptive capabilities that had made previous Old One creations successful. The most extreme faction planned to destroy warp space entirely, eliminating the realm where chaos entities existed, even if this action would also eliminate psychic abilities throughout the galaxy. This proposal represented complete abandonment of everything the Old Ones had achieved, but it offered the possibility of denying their enemies ultimate victory even at the cost of their own extinction. The loss of long-held positions accelerated as each retreat encouraged further rebellion among servant species who interpreted Old One withdrawal as evidence of weakness. The sacred pools of Girin, ancient sites where the first successful consciousness transfer experiments had been conducted, fell to corrupted Slann who transformed them into temples dedicated to excess and sensation. Eldar homeworlds declared independence and began developing cultural practices that celebrated emotional extremes rather than the balanced development their creators had intended. Major breeding facilities where new species had been designed and tested were overrun by chaos cultists who used Old One biological technology to create monstrous beings that served only to spread corruption and generate the emotional energy that fed their new masters. Ancient strongholds that had withstood external assault for millions of years were abandoned within days as their defenders embraced corruption more enthusiastically than they had ever embraced loyalty. Rapid succession of defeats demonstrated that Old One resistance was crumbling faster than their enemies could advance. The Battle of the Singing Stars saw an entire Old One fleet corrupted mid-combat as chaos entities infiltrated their psychic communication networks and convinced the crews that their true enemies were their own commanders. The fall of the Life Gardens marked the transformation of the galaxy's greatest terraforming projects into realms dedicated to exploring every extreme of sensation and experience. The Webway schism permanently corrupted major network nodes throughout the galaxy, creating areas where travel between dimensions became unpredictable and dangerous. The betrayal of the first servants saw the original Slann openly declaring their allegiance to chaos entities and using their intimate knowledge of Old One techniques to accelerate the corruption of remaining loyal populations. Each defeat generated feedback loops that made the situation exponentially worse. Retreating from corrupted territories only provided chaos entities with additional resources and populations to exploit. Former allies became active enemies who possessed intimate knowledge of Old One capabilities and vulnerabilities. Necron forces advanced into territories that Old Ones could no longer defend, creating three-way conflicts that served only to generate additional emotional energy for chaos consumption. The corruption was spreading faster than containment efforts could be organized, with new outbreaks appearing in previously secure regions faster than existing problems could be addressed. The Old Ones found themselves fighting a war they could not win against enemies they had created through their own actions, using techniques that only strengthened their opponents with every application. The survivors faced an impossible choice that would determine the future of all consciousness in the galaxy. Continue fighting and feed chaos with psychic energy. Retreat completely and abandon the galaxy to corruption. Collaborate with their former enemies for hope of survival, or destroy themselves to prevent further damage to reality itself. Each option represented fundamental abandonment of principles and achievements that had defined their civilization for 65 million years. But the alternative was allowing entities of pure malevolence to consume every conscious being in the galaxy. The Old Ones had become prisoners of their own success, trapped by the very capabilities that had made them powerful and unable to escape the consequences of innovations that had seemed beneficial when first implemented. The final battle was approaching, and with it would come decisions that would echo through eternity and shape the nature of existence itself for all species that might survive the coming catastrophe. The convergence of three godlike powers in a single star system represented the culmination of conflicts that had been building for millions of years, and the beginning of catastrophe that would reshape the fundamental nature of reality. The Siege of the Eternal Throne, the Old One's final stronghold in the galactic core, became the stage for a battle that exceeded anything the galaxy had witnessed before or would ever see again. This was not merely warfare between civilizations but a collision of incompatible philosophies about the nature of existence itself, fought with weapons that could unmake reality, and defended by beings who had transcended conventional understanding of life and death. The last stand began when the Old Ones, reduced from a galaxy-spanning empire to refugees huddled in their most ancient fortress system, made the decision to concentrate all remaining resources in one final defensive position. The Eternal Throne had been their first colony, the original world where they had begun their experiments with consciousness and biological manipulation 65 million years earlier. Archaeological layers beneath its surface contain the accumulated history of their entire civilization, from primitive amphibian origins to godlike mastery over life itself. The convergence of three godlike powers in single location threatened to tear reality apart. The convergence began with the arrival of the Necron Silent King, leading the largest military force in recorded history. 10,000 ships of the Necron fleet, translated into the system simultaneously, their emergence from faster-than-light travel, creating gravitational distortions that shattered three of the system's outer planets. These were not the crude vessels of primitive civilizations, but constructs that incorporated technology beyond conventional understanding, ships that existed partially outside normal space-time, weapons that could manipulate probability itself, and warriors who had transcended death so completely that they served as living equations of destruction. Chaos entities poured through corrupted Webway gates in numbers that defied rational calculation. Greater daemons manifested in unprecedented quantities, each one a focused expression of emotional force that could rival the power of minor gods. These were not random manifestations of psychic energy but coordinated assault forces led by entities that had achieved independent existence through consumption of Old One's psychic experiments. Belacor, the first daemon prince, coordinated the chaos assault with strategic sophistication that demonstrated how these entities had learned to combine supernatural power with tactical expertise. The Old Ones responded by activating ancient weapons that had been held in reserve since the earliest days of their civilization. These were not conventional armaments but applications of consciousness itself as a destructive force, devices that could rewrite the genetic structure of entire species in real-time, biological superweapons that could transform matter into living entities programmed for specific purposes, and reality manipulation techniques that allowed them to impose their will on the fundamental laws of physics. Loyalist species throughout the galaxy attempted to evacuate Old One civilians and preserve the knowledge that represented 65 million years of accumulated wisdom. Slan Temple ships loaded with irreplaceable artifacts fought desperate rearguard actions against overwhelming chaos forces. Eldar craft worlds that remained loyal to their creators sacrificed themselves to buy time for evacuation efforts. Even corrupted Krork warrior bands found themselves torn between programmed loyalty to their makers and growing devotion to the blood god who offered them eternal warfare. A critical decision by the Old Ones changed the nature of the battle and sealed their fate. The three-way conflict that erupted defied conventional understanding of warfare. Necron forces sought to finish their ancient enemies through systematic application of superior firepower and technological advantages. Their weapons could disintegrate matter at the quantum level, manipulate time to prevent Old One victories before they occurred, and deploy mechanical entities that adapted to counter any biological weapon deployed against them. Chaos entities wanted to corrupt or consume Old One's souls rather than simply destroy them. Their approach involved psychological warfare on scales that encompassed entire planetary populations, emotional manipulation that could drive rational beings to madness or ecstasy, and reality distortion techniques that transformed physical environments into expressions of pure emotion. Victory for Chaos meant not just defeating the Old Ones but transforming them into willing servants of the very forces they had inadvertently created. Old Ones fought for simple survival against enemies they had underestimated and entities they had inadvertently created through their own experiments. Their weapons were powered by consciousness itself, drawing strength from the collective will of every loyal servant throughout the galaxy. They could create new warrior species during the battle itself, modify existing forces to counter enemy capabilities in real time, and deploy biological technologies that grew stronger through exposure to hostile conditions. The opening moves of the battle demonstrated the impossible scale of forces involved. Necron Gauss weapons began systematically disassembling the Eternal Throne's planetary crust at the atomic level, while tessellation fields allowed destroyed Necron units to reconstruct themselves faster than Old One forces could eliminate them. Chaos corruption spread through Old One's psychic networks like wildfire, turning loyal defenders into enthusiastic enemies within minutes of exposure. Old One biological superweapons released throughout the system created warrior organisms the size of continents, entities that could survive in hard vacuum while deploying weapons that operated according to principles their enemies could not predict or counter. These creatures possessed consciousness sophisticated enough to develop tactics independently while remaining loyal to their creators' objectives. The battle extended into warp space itself as reality became increasingly unstable under the pressure of competing supernatural forces. Fighting occurred simultaneously across multiple dimensions, with victory in material space meaning nothing if the enemy could attack through psychic realms where conventional defenses were ineffective. The boundary between real space and the Imperium collapsed entirely in some regions, creating areas where thought became action and emotion gained physical form. The final moments of the battle would echo through time, shaping the galaxy's dark future. The first turning point came during what survivors termed the Sundering of Souls, when chaos entities began targeting Old One's psychic essence directly rather than limiting themselves to corrupting servant species. The discovery that Old Ones could be possessed like their creations shattered fundamental assumptions about consciousness and vulnerability. Ancient beings who had considered themselves immune to external influence found their own thoughts being rewritten by entities they had never recognized as potential threats. Necron weapons proved unexpectedly effective against chaos entities, as their anti-psychic technology could disrupt the emotional energy that formed the basis of demonic existence. This development led to temporary alliances between some Old Ones and Necron commanders against the common threat of chaos corruption. Former enemies found themselves fighting side by side against entities that threatened to corrupt or consume everything they had ever valued. The critical moment that decided the battle's outcome came when the last council of the Old Ones realized that continued fighting would only strengthen chaos entities regardless of who achieved tactical victory. Every psychic technique they employed fed their true enemies. Every biological weapon they created provided additional targets for corruption. And every use of consciousness-based technology gave the entities more opportunities to infiltrate and manipulate their operations. The choice of the last council represented the most profound moral decision in galactic history. Faced with the certain knowledge that their continued existence would doom every psychic being in the galaxy to eventual corruption, the surviving Old Ones chose to sacrifice themselves rather than allow chaos entities to achieve ultimate victory. This was not surrender in any conventional sense, but acceptance of responsibility for consequences they had never intended but could no longer prevent. The attempt to transfer consciousness into non-psychic vessels, essentially adopting Necron technology to preserve their minds while denying chaos access to their souls, failed catastrophically as their consciousness patterns proved incompatible with mechanical storage systems. Unlike the Necron tier, whose psychology had prepared them for mechanical existence, Old One consciousness was so thoroughly integrated with biological and psychic principles that mechanical preservation was impossible. The mass ritual suicide that followed was designed to deny chaos entities the ultimate prize of Old One's souls, while simultaneously severing the psychic networks that had allowed corruption to spread throughout the galaxy. The Old Ones began systematically destroying their own consciousness patterns, using techniques that ensured their psychic energy would dissipate harmlessly, rather than providing additional power for their enemies. The Silent King's forces, witnessing this ultimate sacrifice, began withdrawing from the battlefield as they realized their victory would be meaningless. The destruction of their ancient enemies through self-annihilation rather than Necron conquest represented a hollow triumph that achieved their tactical objectives while denying them any satisfaction from their success. The war they had fought for millions of years was ending not with decisive victory, but with the recognition that both civilizations had been manipulated by entities neither had fully understood. Chaos entities, glutted on the psychic energy released by dying Old Ones, found themselves temporarily satisfied but also concerned about the loss of the networks that had allowed them to spread throughout the galaxy so effectively. Their victory was complete but came at the cost of eliminating the infrastructure they had planned to use for further expansion. The galaxy would be theirs, but it would be a much smaller prize than they had anticipated. The final moments of the battle saw reality tiers opening across the galaxy as the fundamental forces that had maintained dimensional stability for millions of years collapsed. The Webway network began its final death throes. Dimensional barriers that had separated material space from the warp became permanently permeable, and the careful balance between consciousness and matter that had characterized Old One's civilization dissolved into chaos that would never be fully repaired. The immediate aftermath left the galaxy in a state of shock and confusion that would persist for millions of years. Old One's civilization was effectively destroyed, their accumulated knowledge scattered or lost, and their carefully cultivated servant species left to survive in a universe suddenly devoid of the guidance that had shaped their entire existence. The Necron forces entered their great sleep, having achieved their objectives but recognizing that their victory had cost them everything they had originally sought to preserve. Chaos entities retreated to the warp, gorged on psychic energy, but also confused by the sudden loss of the networks they had used to coordinate their assault. The galaxy they had claimed was broken, its inhabitants traumatized, and its infrastructure damaged beyond any hope of easy repair. They had won the ultimate victory, but at the cost of transforming their prize into something that would require millions of years to rebuild according to their preferences. The cost of the final battle extended far beyond the immediate participants. 65 million years of progress had been destroyed in a conflict that lasted mere decades. The psychic potential of the galaxy was permanently tainted by chaos corruption. The infrastructure supporting trillions of beings was destroyed, and the accumulated knowledge that might have guided future civilizations was lost forever. Reality itself bore scars that would never heal completely. The boundaries between dimensions remained permeable in some regions. Time flowed inconsistently in areas where competing supernatural forces had clashed, and the fundamental laws of physics operated differently in zones where godlike powers had struggled for supremacy. The galaxy had been transformed from a garden of guided evolution into a realm where survival itself required constant struggle against forces that sought to corrupt or consume everything they touched. The galaxy was entering an age of darkness from which it would never fully emerge, where the achievements of the past would be forgotten, and the future would be defined by desperate struggle against enemies that had been created through the ambitions of its former masters. The silence that followed the extinction of the Old Ones was unlike anything the galaxy had ever experienced. For 65 million years, their psychic presence had provided a constant background hum of consciousness that had guided evolution, coordinated civilizations, and maintained the delicate balance between material reality and the warp. When that presence vanished in the space of a few catastrophic decades, the resulting psychic void created a crisis of existence that affected every conscious being from the galactic core to the outer rim. The Great Silence, as surviving historical records termed it, was not merely the absence of Old One guidance, but the complete collapse of systems that had functioned automatically for longer than most species could comprehend. Servant species experiencing collective existential crisis found themselves suddenly free to make choices they had never been allowed to consider, facing responsibilities they had never been prepared to handle, and confronting the reality that their entire understanding of purpose and meaning had been artificial constructs imposed by their creators. Communication networks that had transmitted wisdom and coordination across interstellar distances fell silent within days of the Old Ones' extinction. These networks had been more than technological systems. They were expressions of consciousness itself, psychic webs that had connected every enhanced species in the galaxy through shared thoughts and emotions. When the central nodes controlling these networks were destroyed or abandoned, the resulting isolation forced civilizations that had never existed independently to suddenly confront the universe alone. Unexpected new problems emerging from the transition. Transportation systems shut down across the galaxy, as Webway gates ceased to function without Old One maintenance. The few passages that remained operational became increasingly dangerous, as chaos entities established permanent residence in the dimensional tunnels. What had once been the safest form of travel became a journey through realms where hostile intelligences hunted anything possessing consciousness, transforming necessary journeys into potentially fatal encounters with beings that offered corruption as the price of passage. The confusion and disorder that followed affected different species in drastically different ways, revealing how artificial the unity of Old One's civilization had actually been. Without genetic programming to maintain loyalty and behavioral conditioning to ensure cooperation, the fundamental differences between species created conflicts that had been suppressed for millions of years. Species that had worked together harmoniously under Old One guidance suddenly found themselves competitors for resources and territory in a galaxy where central authority no longer existed. Eldar civilization faced the most immediate crisis as their psychology, specifically engineered for emotional extremes, began manifesting in ways their creators had never intended. Without Old One oversight to channel their passions toward productive purposes, Eldar society began developing cultural practices that celebrated excess for its own sake. The cults that had emerged during the final stages of the war grew into dominant social movements that transformed Eldar worlds into realms dedicated to exploring every possible sensation and experience. The Eldar's attempt to preserve Old One culture and knowledge quickly became corrupted by their engineered need for intense emotional experiences. Scholarly pursuits became obsessions with forbidden knowledge, artistic endeavors became celebrations of excess and sensation, and military traditions transformed into ritualistic combat that prioritized emotional intensity over strategic effectiveness. Their efforts to maintain their creator's legacy were gradually subverted by psychological drives that made moderation literally impossible for their species. New threats during vulnerable transition period. The Krork faced a different but equally catastrophic transformation as they devolved into the Orks through constant warfare and genetic degradation. Without Old One guidance to maintain their sophisticated biological programming, their genetic templates began simplifying under the pressure of continuous combat. The strategic intelligence that had made them effective weapons gradually gave way to simple aggression. Their advanced technological capabilities were replaced by crude instincts that barely maintained functionality, and their organized military structure dissolved into tribal warfare that served no purpose beyond the immediate satisfaction of fighting. This devolution was not merely decay, but a fundamental change in consciousness, as the Krork's enhanced mental capabilities proved unsustainable without external support. Each generation became slightly more primitive than the last, losing knowledge and sophistication until they retained only the most basic aspects of their original programming. The greatest warriors in galactic history became crude savages whose technological achievements operated through collective belief rather than scientific understanding. Slan's retreat to isolated temple cities represented perhaps the most successful immediate response to Old One extinction. But even this apparent success came with significant costs. The surviving Slan attempted to preserve their creator's knowledge and continue their biological experiments, but they lacked the fundamental understanding necessary to maintain the sophisticated techniques they had been taught to implement. Their efforts became increasingly ritualistic and dogmatic as they tried to follow procedures they could no longer fully comprehend. The temple cities became isolated islands of stability in a galaxy descending into chaos, but they also became stagnant centers where knowledge was preserved without being understood or developed. The Slan transformed from active agents of Old One will into conservative custodians of traditions they could maintain but not improve. Their isolation protected them from immediate corruption but also prevented them from adapting to changed circumstances or developing solutions to new problems. Consequences were only beginning. Humans, still primitive by galactic standards, but possessing subtle genetic modifications that enhanced their psychic potential, began their slow climb from barbarism with capabilities their ancestors had never possessed. The Old One enhancements that had been dormant in human genetics began manifesting as environmental pressures forced rapid social and technological development. But these enhancements came with vulnerabilities that made humans susceptible to the same chaos corruption that had destroyed their creators. Human development during this period was characterized by tremendous potential, coupled with equally tremendous instability. Their enhanced psychic abilities allowed rapid technological advancement, but also made them targets for chaos entities seeking new hosts and servants. Early human civilizations achieved remarkable sophistication only to be destroyed by internal conflicts driven by corruption they could neither understand nor resist. Power vacuum struggles erupted across the galaxy as former servant species attempted to establish control over territories that had been managed by Old One authorities for millions of years. These conflicts were complicated by the fact that many species lacked the knowledge necessary to maintain the biological systems that supported their civilizations. Terraformed worlds began reverting to their original conditions. Enhanced ecosystems collapsed without proper management, and technological systems that required psychic interface became inoperable. Former servants fighting for territorial control often found themselves battling over resources they could not properly utilize or territories they lacked the knowledge to govern effectively. The administrative systems that had managed galactic civilization required understanding of biological principles that the Old Ones had never shared with their servants. Victory in these struggles often proved meaningless as the winners discovered they could not maintain what they had captured. Chaos cults, spreading among abandoned populations, provided an alternative to the confusion and despair that characterized the post-Old One galaxy. These cults offered simple explanations for complex problems and promised power to beings who felt helpless in the face of circumstances beyond their control. The entities that had corrupted the Old Ones proved equally effective at manipulating their abandoned servants, using their desperation and confusion as entry points for corruption. The spread of chaos worship was facilitated by the collapse of communication networks that had previously allowed rapid coordination of anti-corruption efforts. Isolated populations were particularly vulnerable to cult infiltration as they lacked the resources to verify information or coordinate with other communities facing similar problems. The very isolation that protected some species from immediate corruption also made them easier targets for systematic conversion. Technology failing without Old One maintenance created additional crises, as biological systems that had operated automatically for millions of years began breaking down. Living ships became unable to repair themselves, organic computers lost their programming, and biological weapons became inert or dangerous to their operators. The elegant integration of consciousness and technology that had characterized Old One's civilization could not be maintained by species that lacked understanding of the principles involved. Knowledge was being lost faster than it could be preserved as the psychic networks that had stored information became inaccessible or corrupted. Each species retained only the knowledge that had been directly relevant to their assigned functions, losing the broader understanding that had allowed Old One's civilization to function as an integrated whole. Libraries became useless as their contents required psychic interface techniques that were no longer teachable, and educational systems collapsed as the masters who had maintained them were no longer available. New dangers emerged from the breakdown of systems that had maintained galactic stability for millions of years. Warp storms made travel between star systems impossible in many regions, as the networks that had stabilized dimensional boundaries ceased to function. These storms were more than mere navigational hazards. They were expressions of chaos entities testing their newfound freedom to manifest in material space without Old One opposition. Ancient weapons began activating without proper control, as automated systems responded to the changed circumstances according to programming that no longer served useful purposes. Defense systems designed to protect Old One installations from external threats began targeting anything they identified as potentially hostile, including the very species they had been created to protect. These weapons possessed capabilities that exceeded anything available to post-Old One civilizations, making them impossible to shut down or reprogram. Chaos entities hunting psychic survivors created a constant atmosphere of terror for any being possessing psychic abilities. These entities had learned to operate more effectively in material space through their consumption of Old One consciousness, making them more dangerous to surviving psychic species than they had ever been during the war itself. Psychic ability, once the mark of enhanced status in Old One civilization, became a liability that attracted potentially fatal attention. Ecological collapse on terraformed worlds created environmental catastrophes that affected billions of beings as biological systems designed to maintain optimal conditions began failing without proper oversight. The Old Ones had created ecosystems that were more efficient and productive than natural evolution could achieve, but these systems required constant management to maintain their artificial balance. Without that management, they became unstable and often destructive to the very species they had been designed to support. The immediate aftermath of Old One extinction set the stage for an age of darkness that would persist for millions of years. The galaxy had lost not just its rulers, but the fundamental systems that had maintained civilization on an interstellar scale. The species that survived would be forced to rebuild everything from basic principles, lacking both the knowledge and the resources that had made Old One achievements possible. Recovery would require not just technological advancement, but fundamental changes in how consciousness itself was understood and applied. The Old Ones had demonstrated that psychic power could reshape reality, but they had also proven that such power carried risks that could destroy civilizations. Future species would need to find ways to achieve advancement without repeating the mistakes that had led to galactic catastrophe. The galaxy was entering an era where survival would depend on avoiding the attention of entities that had already consumed gods, where knowledge would be more valuable than territory, and where the greatest achievements of the past would serve as warnings rather than inspiration for future development. The technological legacy of the Old Ones proved to be both blessing and curse for the species that inherited their shattered galaxy. Unlike the complete destruction that many expected, fragments of their vast civilization persisted across millions of worlds, creating archaeological treasures that would inspire and torment future generations for eons to come. The Webway network, though catastrophically damaged, remained partially functional in isolated sections, providing tantalizing glimpses of transportation capabilities that exceeded anything subsequent civilizations could achieve. Imperial archaeotech expeditions, launched with tremendous fanfare and resources, occasionally discovered Old One installations that had somehow survived the collapse of their civilization. These discoveries represented both incredible opportunities and terrible dangers, as the biological technologies found within often retained some measure of autonomous function despite being abandoned for millions of years. Tech priests who attempted to study these artifacts frequently found themselves dealing with systems that seemed to anticipate their needs, while simultaneously resisting all attempts at analysis or replication. Influence proved indestructible across eons. Eldar Wraithbone technology, the foundation of their post-fall civilization, derived directly from Old One knowledge preserved in their genetic memory and racial consciousness. The psychically responsive material that formed the basis of Eldar craftworlds and weapons represented a crude but functional application of principles their creators had mastered millions of years earlier. Yet even this limited inheritance made the Eldar the most technologically sophisticated species in the galaxy aside from the awakening Necrons, demonstrating how far ahead of their time the Old Ones had been. The Wraithbone itself exhibited characteristics that defied Imperial understanding of material science, growing and shaping itself according to psychic commands, while maintaining structural integrity that exceeded conventional metals and ceramics. Magos Biologus, who had studied captured Eldar technology, reported that the material seemed to possess a form of consciousness, responding to emotional states and psychic resonance in ways that suggested it was as much living organism as manufactured product. Ork technological instincts preserve fragments of Krork engineering knowledge through genetic programming that operated below the level of conscious awareness. Modern Orks possessed an intuitive understanding of mechanical principles that allowed them to build sophisticated weapons from scrap materials, but they retain no conscious memory of the advanced civilization their ancestors had represented. Their technology functioned through collective belief rather than scientific understanding, a degraded echo of Old One biological engineering that had once allowed consciousness to directly manipulate matter. The most advanced Ork mechboys occasionally produced devices that exceeded their apparent technological base, creating weapons and vehicles that incorporated principles their builders could not explain or deliberately replicate. These achievements represented momentary breakthroughs where genetic memory briefly surfaced above the threshold of consciousness, providing access to knowledge that had been encoded into Krork DNA 65 million years earlier. Imperial archaeotech discoveries occurred with sufficient frequency to drive entire explorator fleets to search for Old One ruins across the galaxy. The Adeptus Mechanicus had cataloged over 3,000 confirmed Old One sites, ranging from simple outposts to vast research complexes that spanned entire continents. Each discovery provided invaluable insights into technologies that operated according to principles the Imperium could barely comprehend, let alone duplicate. These archaeological sites often contained biological computers that still function despite their incredible age, processing information according to organic algorithms that combine calculation with intuition in ways that exceeded the capabilities of conventional machine spirits. Some installations had maintained themselves through automated systems that adapted to changing conditions over millions of years, creating self-sustaining technological ecosystems that continued to function without external support or maintenance. Effects continuing beyond all expectations. The cultural impact of Old One civilization extended far beyond technological inheritance to shape the fundamental mythologies and belief systems of every species they had created or influenced. Eldar mythology remains centered on creator gods whose achievements and failures provided the framework for understanding their own place in the galaxy. The concept of the Fall, the catastrophic collapse of a golden age due to excess and corruption, dominated Eldar thinking about progress and civilization in ways that made them inherently conservative about technological advancement and cultural change. Eldar prophets and seers maintained that their creators' knowledge remained accessible through deep meditation and psychic communion with racial memory. But attempts to recover this information were complicated by the psychological trauma associated with the Old Ones' extinction. The genetic programming that had made the Eldar loyal servants also made it psychologically difficult for them to acknowledge that their creators had failed, leading to complex defensive mechanisms that obscured as much knowledge as they preserved. Ork collective memory preserved fragments of better times, when their ancestors had been mighty warriors serving powerful masters who had respected their capabilities and provided them with endless opportunities for glorious combat. These memories manifested as a persistent sense that current circumstances, however satisfying they might be, represented a degraded echo of past greatness that could potentially be reclaimed through sufficient violence and cunning. The Ork concept of WAAAAAAA energy drew directly from Old One techniques for harnessing collective consciousness as a source of power, though modern Orks understood this only as an instinctive recognition that gathering large numbers of their kind would somehow make their technology work better and their battles more satisfying. The psychic resonance created by large Ork gatherings could indeed alter local reality in ways that made their crude weapons function more effectively than engineering principles suggested they should. Human myths of a golden age and subsequent fall appeared in the folklore of countless worlds throughout the Imperium, suggesting that Old One genetic modifications had included cultural programming that preserved memories of their creators' achievements. These myths typically described a time when gods walked among mortals, when death was optional rather than inevitable, and when the galaxy was a garden of peace and prosperity rather than the war-torn hellscape it had become. The recurring themes in human mythology, the benevolent but distant creators, the corruption of paradise through forbidden knowledge, the fall from grace followed by endless struggle, provided an eerily accurate description of Old One civilization and its destruction. Imperial scholars who studied these patterns found them too consistent across isolated human populations to be coincidental, suggesting that genetic memory preserved cultural information as well as biological capabilities. Subject may not be finished with galaxy. Chaos corruption remained the most persistent and dangerous legacy of Old One experimentation, spreading across the galaxy through mechanisms that operated independently of the civilization that had created them. The entities that had emerged from Old One consciousness manipulation continued to grow stronger with each generation of psychically active beings, feeding on emotions and desires that were fundamental aspects of consciousness itself. The Chaos Gods had achieved independent existence that no longer required the psychic networks through which they had originally spread, making them a permanent feature of galactic existence, rather than a temporary consequence of Old One mistakes. They had learned to operate through conventional communication and physical contact when psychic methods were unavailable, ensuring that their influence could spread even among species that lacked psychic abilities. Ongoing conflicts throughout the galaxy bore the mark of Old One influence in ways that most participants never recognized. The eternal struggle between Eldar and Chaos forces represented a continuation of the war that had destroyed their creators, fought with inherited weapons and knowledge against enemies that had consumed gods. Ork expeditions followed patterns of warfare that had been established during the final battles between Old Ones and Necrons, driven by genetic imperatives that sought to recreate the epic conflicts of the past. Imperial crusades against Xenos taint often targeted species that carried Old One genetic modifications, responding to programming that identified enhanced biological capabilities as inherently threatening to human purity. This conflict represented a continuation of the philosophical disagreements that had led to the war between Old Ones and Necrontyr, fought by descendants who no longer understood the original issues but remained driven by inherited behavioral patterns. Necron awakening to a changed galaxy forced the ancient enemies of the Old Ones to confront the consequences of their victory. In a universe that no longer resembled the one they had sought to preserve, the natural evolution they had fought to protect had been replaced by chaos corruption. The mechanical perfection they had achieved was threatened by entities that could corrupt technology as easily as biology, and their hollow victory had left them rulers of a galaxy that had become everything they had originally opposed. Hidden survivors of the Old One catastrophe remained one of the most persistent mysteries confronting galactic civilization. Rumors circulated among Eldar seers about Old One remnants surviving in the deepest parts of the Webway, maintaining isolated refuges, where they continued their biological experiments while avoiding contact with the corrupted galaxy. These rumors were supported by occasional discoveries of impossibly advanced biological technologies that seemed too sophisticated to be mere archaeological remnants. Slan temple cities and isolated regions continued to maintain ancient knowledge and perform rituals that preserved fragments of Old One techniques, though their understanding was increasingly ritualistic rather than scientific. These surviving Slan claimed to receive guidance from their sleeping masters, but whether this represented genuine communication or psychological need to believe their creators still existed remained unclear. The possibility of genetic descendants among various species raised questions about whether the Old Ones had attempted to preserve themselves through biological inheritance rather than direct survival. Some Imperial xenobiologists speculated that certain human psyker bloodlines might carry Old One genetic material, while Eldar genealogists maintained detailed records of family lines that claimed direct descent from the creators themselves. Ancient installations throughout the galaxy continued to function according to programs established millions of years earlier, suggesting that Old One influence persisted through automated systems that operated beyond the reach of conventional interference. These installations occasionally produced new biological constructs that served unknown purposes, maintained environmental conditions that benefited no known species, and transmitted signals that followed patterns too complex to be coincidental. The most disturbing possibility was that the Old Ones had anticipated their own destruction and established contingency plans that would only activate under specific conditions. Imperial scholars who studied the patterns of Old One technology noted that many installations seemed designed to respond to galactic-scale crises, potentially providing resources or capabilities that would only become available when the galaxy faced threats comparable to those that had destroyed their creators. The long-term consequences of Old One's civilization extended beyond technology and genetics, to shape the fundamental nature of reality itself in ways that could never be completely undone. Their experiments with consciousness had permanently altered the relationship between mind and matter. Their manipulation of evolution had created species that could never have existed naturally, and their destruction had established precedents for how advanced civilizations could fall to corruption they had created through their own actions. The galaxy they had shaped through 65 million years of careful cultivation would bear their influence forever, regardless of what other powers might rise or fall in the eons to come. Their greatest achievement, the demonstration that consciousness could reshape reality according to will and design, remained available to any species sophisticated enough to understand and apply their techniques. But their greatest failure, the proof that such power carried risks that could destroy gods themselves, served as an eternal warning about the dangers of ambition unchecked by wisdom. In the grim darkness of the far future, the shadow of the Old Ones falls across every aspect of existence, from the smallest gene cults hiding in the underhives of Terra, to the vast craft worlds that drift through the void carrying the last remnants of their creator's vision. Modern discoveries continue to reveal the scope of their influence, while raising new questions about what knowledge might still be recovered from the ruins of their civilization. The galaxy's greatest tragedy is not that the Old Ones are gone, but that their absence has left behind mysteries that may hold the keys to either salvation or damnation for every species that struggles to survive in the hellscape they inadvertently created. Imperial excavations of Old One sites have accelerated dramatically in recent centuries, as the Adeptus Mechanicus recognizes that these ancient ruins may contain technologies crucial for humanity's survival in an increasingly hostile galaxy. Each expedition uncovers artifacts that challenge fundamental assumptions about what is possible through the application of consciousness and biological engineering. Tech priests who study these discoveries often report that the technologies seem to anticipate their needs, responding to questions they have not yet asked, and providing solutions to problems they have not yet recognized. The most significant recent discovery occurred on the world of Tertius, where explorator teams found a vast biological computer that had maintained itself in operational condition for 65 million years. This device, which the Mechanicus designated Xenotech Primary Cogitator XP-1, demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything in Imperial archives. It could process information at rates that made even the most advanced machine spirits seem primitive, store data in organic matrices that adapted to prevent corruption, and interface directly with human consciousness through methods that bypassed conventional neural implants entirely. Story may not be over. Signs suggest stirring. But XP-1 also exhibited disturbing characteristics that suggested Old One technology retains some measure of autonomous intelligence. The device showed preferences about which information it would reveal, displayed what appeared to be emotional responses to certain types of queries, and occasionally provided warnings about dangers that Mechanicus personnel had not yet recognized. Most unnervingly, it seemed to be learning from its interactions with Imperial researchers, developing capabilities that had not been present when first activated. Eldar prophecies regarding the possible return of their creators have become increasingly specific and urgent in recent millennia. Foreseer councils report visions of amphibious figures emerging from the deepest parts of the Webway, carrying knowledge that could either save the galaxy from chaos corruption, or complete its transformation into a realm where only the strongest emotions could survive. These prophecies are complicated by the Eldar's own psychological need to believe their creators might return, making it difficult to distinguish genuine foresight from wishful thinking. The Webway craft world has maintained the most comprehensive archives of Old One lore, preserving not just historical records but active research programs dedicated to understanding their creators' techniques. Autarch Silandri Veilwalker, speaking before the Path of the Seer Council, claimed that recent expeditions into abandoned Webway passages had discovered evidence of ongoing Old One activity in realms beyond conventional exploration. These reports described installations that showed signs of recent maintenance, biological experiments that were still in progress, and automated systems that responded to Eldar presence with recognition rather than hostility. Implications both hopeful and terrifying for future. Chaos Daemon references to the first enemy have become more frequent in recent centuries, suggesting that the entities which destroyed Old One civilization retain vivid memories of their ancient adversaries. During the interrogation of the greater daemon known as Shargastek, the Mouth of Secrets, Ordo Malleus Inquisitors learned that Chaos entities still feared the possibility of Old One return, viewing their ancient enemies as the only force that had ever successfully challenged their growing dominance over psychic energy. The daemon's testimony, verified through multiple psychic scans and corroborated by similar statements from other captured entities, suggested that the Old Ones had established contingency plans that would activate if chaos corruption reached critical levels throughout the galaxy. These plans supposedly included biological time locks that would release Old One knowledge when specific conditions were met, hidden installations that would become accessible only during galactic-scale crises, and genetic triggers that would awaken dormant capabilities in their created species when survival depended on recovering their creators' techniques. Necron records of the ancient war, recovered from tomb complexes across the galaxy, provide the most objective historical accounts of Old One capabilities and the factors that led to their extinction. The Silent King's personal archives, accessed during negotiations with Imperial forces against Tyranid incursions, revealed that Necron strategists had never considered their victory over the Old Ones to be complete. Their analysis suggested that beings capable of creating consciousness from raw matter and encoding intelligence into genetic material would have established multiple forms of backup preservation that could survive even total military defeat. Necron cryptechs studying captured Old One artifacts reported that many devices showed signs of automatic repair and improvement functions that operated according to principles their mechanical intelligence could not fully analyze. These technologies seem to evolve in response to changing conditions, suggesting that Old One installations might be adapting to current galactic circumstances rather than simply maintaining ancient programming. The current relevance of Old One legacy extends far beyond archaeological interest, to shape every aspect of contemporary galactic politics and warfare. The Webway remains crucial to Eldar survival, as their only means of traveling safely through a galaxy where conventional warp travel exposes them to the chaos entities that specifically target their species. Imperial attempts to understand and utilize Webway passages have met with limited success, as the network seems to respond preferentially to consciousness patterns that match those of its creators, understanding them key to galaxy's survival. Ork genetics continue to follow Old One programming in ways that make them increasingly dangerous as their populations grow. Recent analysis by Magos Biologist Call revealed that Ork reproductive rates and technological capabilities both increase exponentially when large populations concentrate in confined areas, suggesting that their genetic programming includes mechanisms for achieving rapid advancement when environmental pressures demand it. This discovery raised alarming questions about what capabilities might emerge if Ork populations reach the density that characterized their Krork ancestors. Human psychers displaying Old One enhancement legacy represent both tremendous opportunity and catastrophic risk for Imperial civilization. The genetic modifications that grant psychic abilities also create vulnerabilities to chaos corruption that increase proportionally with power level. Recent studies of alpha-level psychers revealed that their capabilities often exceeded anything explainable through human genetics alone, suggesting that dormant Old One modifications were becoming active in response to the galaxy's increasing psychic instability. Chaos entities continuing to feed on psychic activity throughout the galaxy demonstrated that the corruption which destroyed the Old Ones remained as virulent as ever. The emotional energy generated by warfare, suffering, and desperation in the current era provided sustenance for entities that had grown stronger during the 65 million years since their creator's extinction. Each new conflict fed their power while creating conditions that made future corruption more likely. Unanswered questions about Old One legacy continue to multiply as new discoveries reveal the scope of what remains unknown. Whether any Old Ones truly survived their civilization's collapse remained the central mystery, with evidence supporting multiple contradictory conclusions. Some discoveries suggested that individual Old Ones had achieved forms of preservation that transcended physical existence, while others indicated that their consciousness had been distributed among their creations in ways that made survival possible without requiring conventional biological continuity. The possibility that their creations could be fixed, restored to their intended functions, without the corruption that had led to the Old One's destruction, represented perhaps the most important question for galactic future. If Eldar could be freed from their vulnerability to chaos corruption, if Orks could be restored to their original core capabilities, and if humans could be stabilized against psychic corruption, the galaxy might regain access to technologies and capabilities that could challenge even the Chaos Gods themselves. What other species throughout the galaxy might carry Old One genetic markers remained largely unexplored due to Imperial policies that discouraged detailed xenobiological research. Preliminary surveys suggested that hundreds of minor species showed signs of artificial enhancement that exceeded natural evolutionary patterns. But political considerations prevented comprehensive analysis that might reveal the full scope of Old One influence. The question of whether new Old Ones might be evolving from modified species represented the most speculative, but potentially significant possibility. If consciousness could be encoded into genetic material and preserved across generations, the accumulated experience and knowledge of entire civilizations might be slowly coalescing into new forms of awareness that possess their creators' capabilities without their fatal flaws. Connections to current events revealed that every major crisis facing the galaxy bore the mark of Old One, influence in ways that participants rarely recognized. The Emperor's Webway project represented a direct attempt to recreate Old One achievements using human understanding and capabilities. The project's failure, and the resulting imprisonment of the Emperor demonstrated that even the galaxy's most powerful psyker could not safely manipulate the forces that had destroyed civilizations far more advanced than the Imperium. Elder Craftworlds served as Old One legacy preservation projects, maintaining knowledge and techniques that would otherwise be lost while adapting them to survive in a corrupted galaxy. The path system that governed Eldar society represented a sophisticated method for preventing the emotional extremes that had made their species vulnerable to chaos corruption, essentially using their creators' understanding of psychology to counteract the flaws in their original design. Ork resurgence following Old One warfare patterns suggested that genetic programming established millions of years earlier was still influencing behavior on galactic scales. Major WAD's AJJ expeditions followed strategic patterns that seemed designed to test and strengthen Imperial defenses while providing opportunities for Ork technological advancement through combat experience. The Tyranid invasion raised questions about whether these creatures might represent an Old One contingency plan. Biological weapons designed to consume corrupted organic matter and restore the galaxy to a state where new evolutionary experiments could begin. The Tyranids' ability to adapt to any defensive measure and their apparent immunity to chaos corruption suggested capabilities that exceeded natural evolution, though their origins remained unknown. In the grim darkness of the far future, the Old One's shadow still falls across every world, every species, every soul. They were the galaxy's first gods, and their death created the hell we now inhabit. Yet in their genetic legacy, their scattered knowledge, and their impossible achievements, lies perhaps the only hope for redemption from the darkness they inadvertently birthed. The question that haunts every scholar who studies their legacy, every psyker who touches the edges of their knowledge, and every being who struggles against the chaos they unleashed, is whether their greatest creation, the capacity for conscious evolution, will ultimately save or damn us all. The Old Ones proved that consciousness could reshape reality, but they also demonstrated that such power carried risks that could destroy gods themselves. Their story is our story, for we are all children of their ambition and victims of their failure. In understanding how they rose to become masters of the galaxy, and how they fell to corruption they could not comprehend, we may yet find the wisdom necessary to avoid repeating their mistakes. Or we may discover that some forms of knowledge are too dangerous for any species to possess. The galaxy awaits the answer, caught between the dying light of ancient achievement and the growing darkness of eternal war, while entities that devoured gods themselves continue to feast on the remnants of the Old One's greatest creation, consciousness itself.